In the dense, shadowy forests of the New Jersey Pine Barrens, the legend of the Jersey Devil was born. The year was 1735, and whispers of dark occurrences spread through the tight-knit, superstitious communities that called this untamed wilderness home. The origins of the tale began with a woman known as Mother Leeds, whose story was destined to be recounted and altered over generations, evolving into the chilling myth that persists to this day. Mother Leeds was no stranger to hardship. She lived in the remote Pine Barrens, where life was harsh and the land unforgiving. She and her husband, Daniel Leeds, struggled to support their large family. With 12 children already filling their modest home, the thought of yet another mouth to feed filled Mother Leeds with dread. Some versions of the story depict her as an exhausted and frustrated woman who could no longer bear the burden of raising such a large family under desperate circumstances. As the legend goes, Mother Leeds discovered she was pregnant with her 13th child and, in a moment of frustration, uttered words that would come to haunt her. "Let this one be a devil." It was not uncommon for people in that time to curse their misfortunes, but her words seemed to carry an ominous weight. Soon after, strange occurrences began to plague the Leeds household, as if the land itself were reacting to the spoken curse. The wind howled through the trees with an unsettling wail, and shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. Months passed, and as her pregnancy progressed, Mother Leeds was filled with a sense of dread she could not shake. On a stormy night, she went into labor, with the roar of thunder echoing through the forests and the wind rattling the walls of the modest cabin. She was attended by midwives, who came despite their own fears of venturing into the dark woods during such tempestuous weather. As they gathered around, the labor seemed to drag on far longer than usual, as if something unnatural was at work. When the child was finally born, it seemed at first to be a healthy, ordinary baby. Relief filled the room, and the midwives began their usual tasks. However, as moments passed, that relief quickly turned into terror. The newborn began to change before their eyes, its cries growing louder and more guttural. Its small body elongated, limbs stretching and contorting unnaturally. Thin, bat-like wings sprouted from its back, and coarse hair emerged along its skin. The creature's eyes glowed with a fiery intensity as its face twisted into a grotesque, animalistic form with a snout and jagged teeth. It was as though some dark force had possessed the child, transforming it into a creature that defied all understanding. Panic gripped the midwives, who recoiled in horror as the creature let out an inhuman shriek and took flight, bursting through the cabin's roof and disappearing into the night. The legend claims it escaped into the depths of the Pine Barrens, leaving a trail of shattered timber and broken shingles behind. As the howling winds faded, the house fell silent, except for the terrified cries of Mother Leeds, whose life had been forever altered by that cursed night. In the days that followed, stories about the events in the Leeds household spread quickly through the local villages. Some whispered that the baby was indeed born with a curse, while others believed that Mother Leeds had dabbled in dark practices, invoking powers beyond her control. There were those who said she had made a pact with forces unseen, an unholy bargain for a reason that remained a mystery. Rumors also circulated that the Leeds family was associated with other forms of local superstition and dissent, adding fuel to the fire. As the tale spread, the child's transformation into the Jersey Devil became more elaborate, with each retelling layering new details onto the existing lore. The local religious community viewed this story as a warning against sinful behavior and moral decay. They saw the events as divine retribution for what they believed was Mother Leeds' blasphemous curse. The Pine Barrens, with its vast, dark forests and twisting trails, became a breeding ground for superstition. People whispered that the woods themselves had a life of their own, and that Mother Leeds' cursed child roamed them as a creature of vengeance or punishment. Farmers and travelers claimed to hear strange cries at night, and there were occasional reports of livestock disappearing or being found with bizarre injuries. The Leeds family name, once associated with the influential and sometimes controversial almanac writer Daniel Leeds, grew darker with each passing year as the story of the Jersey Devil became intertwined with the family's own complicated history. Daniel Leeds himself was no stranger to controversy. His writings had been condemned as heretical by some religious leaders, leading to suspicions that his family had fallen under some kind of supernatural influence. Thus, the tale of the Jersey Devil was not merely a ghost story, but also a reflection of the fears and conflicts of the time. The story would continue to evolve, becoming a part of local folklore and an emblem of the mysterious Pine Barrens. With each generation, new elements were added. The creature was said to have cloven hooves, a serpent-like tail, and the ability to breathe fire. Some stories suggested it could vanish into thin air, or that it appeared as a foreboding omen before disasters. The legend became ingrained in the culture of New Jersey, passed down from parents to children as a cautionary tale. In this way, the Jersey Devil became more than just a myth. It was a symbol of the dark unknown, the fears that lurked on the edges of society, and the potential consequences of words spoken in anger. As time went on, the details of its origins were debated, but the essence of the story persisted. A child, cursed from birth, transformed into a creature that roamed the Pine Barrens, leaving behind a legacy that would be told and retold for centuries. Mother Leeds' tale was just the beginning. What had started as a night of terror in a small, rural cabin would grow into one of America's most enduring legends, forever haunting the dark woods of New Jersey. The legend of the Jersey Devil, rooted in the terrifying events surrounding Mother Leeds, began to spread far beyond the Leeds household, becoming a tale that seeped into the very fabric of life in southern New Jersey. In the 18th and 19th centuries, sightings of a strange creature in the Pine Barrens grew in frequency, captivating the imaginations and fears of the people living in the area. These early reports varied widely, but they all carried one consistent theme. There was something unnatural dwelling in the dense, dark woods. The Pine Barrens itself, a sprawling forest of nearly 1 million acres, was an environment that seemed tailor-made for legends. It was a place of winding trails, boggy marshes, and trees so thick that sunlight struggled to penetrate. The forest had long been viewed with suspicion by settlers, who saw it as a wild, untamed land. Even the Native American tribes, such as the Lenape, spoke of spirits in the woods, though their lore did not describe anything quite like the Jersey Devil. The stories that emerged in the wake of Mother Leeds' fateful night added a new layer of dread to a place already shrouded in mystery. The first recorded sightings of the creature began to appear not long after the legend's origin. These early accounts spoke of a flying beast with wings and a hideous, animal-like face. Witnesses often described seeing the creature during moonless nights, when the sky was black and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Farmers reported strange tracks near their properties, hoofprints unlike those of any known animal, and some claimed to have lost livestock under mysterious circumstances. Their remains discovered with peculiar marks and no signs of a struggle. The sightings were not limited to rural farms. They occurred near towns as well. People spoke of encountering the creature along lonely roads, its figure emerging from the darkness to spread its wings and take flight, disappearing into the night sky with a bone-chilling screech. The descriptions varied in detail, but shared enough similarities to keep the legend alive. Some spoke of the creature as being the size of a large dog, while others insisted it was much larger, with a wingspan that stretched 10 feet or more. Its face, they said, was ghastly, a twisted mix of horse-like features and something else, something more sinister. As these accounts circulated, the Jersey Devil became a symbol of the unknown dangers lurking in the Pine Barrens. The early settlers, already living in a land that felt wild and unpredictable, found a new reason to fear the woods at night. It wasn't long before the Jersey Devil began to take on a near mythical status, with sightings spreading beyond the immediate area and becoming known in neighboring states like Pennsylvania and Delaware. Each new report seemed to add to the creature's lore, with the details morphing and expanding as the story spread from mouth to mouth. The local communities, largely isolated and deeply rooted in superstition, embraced the tale with a mix of fear and fascination. The Jersey Devil was not just a tale of a monstrous beast. It was a reflection of the people's anxieties, a manifestation of their unease with the harsh wilderness and the difficult lives they led. The creature came to represent the unpredictability of nature, a symbol of the forces that lay just beyond human understanding. Religious leaders sometimes used the legend to illustrate sermons, presenting the Jersey Devil as a sign of the devil's work or as a warning against moral decay. The narrative of the creature's origins, involving a cursed child and a mother's desperate words, played into the idea of divine punishment, a notion that resonated in the deeply religious communities of the time. As stories continued to circulate, some were written down, further cementing the Jersey Devil's place in folklore. Newspaper articles from as early as the late 18th century referenced the creature, although these accounts often carried a tone of skepticism, treating the sightings as curious local tales rather than serious events. Still, enough people reported seeing the creature or claimed to know someone who had that the legend persisted. In fact, the mystery surrounding the Jersey Devil seemed only to deepen with each new account. The Pine Barrens' reputation grew darker, and the people living near its borders took additional precautions, especially at night. Among the most unsettling reports were those from hunters and woodsmen, people who spent much of their time in the forests and were familiar with the local wildlife. These men spoke of encountering something that defied explanation, a beast whose movements were unnatural and whose presence sent chills down their spines. Some told of hearing strange cries echoing through the trees, a sound that could not be attributed to any known animal. A few claimed to have glimpsed the creature up close, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness before it vanished, leaving them shaken and bewildered. The legend began to attract more attention from those outside the region, including skeptics and scholars. While some dismissed the stories as mere superstition or the exaggerations of frightened minds, others were intrigued by the consistency in the descriptions. Cryptozoologists, though not yet a recognized field at the time, would have considered the accounts with great interest, noting how folklore could sometimes hint at unknown species or animals not yet classified by science. It was suggested that the Jersey Devil might be a misidentified species, an animal unknown to the scientific community, or even a creature brought over from another continent during the age of exploration. However, for the locals who lived near the Pine Barrens, the Jersey Devil was not simply a curiosity, it was a very real part of their lives. They took its presence seriously, sometimes avoiding certain areas at night and sharing stories of encounters to warn others. Families passed down tales of the creature from generation to generation, each new version adding details or altering the story slightly, but always keeping the core of the legend alive. Children grew up hearing bedtime stories of the beast that roamed the woods, and young men dared each other to go deep into the forest to see if they could catch a glimpse of the infamous Jersey Devil. The early sightings of the Jersey Devil did more than just entertain or frighten. They helped shape the identity of the Pine Barrens and the people who lived there. The legend offered a sense of continuity in a world that was rapidly changing, with new settlers arriving and industrialization slowly encroaching on the once untamed wilderness. In some ways, the Jersey Devil served as a guardian of the old ways, a reminder that despite humanity's attempts to tame the world, there would always be mysteries beyond our control. It was a story that belonged to the land itself, a legend that grew from the soil of the Pine Barrens and took root in the hearts and minds of those who called it home. As more people came to believe in the Jersey Devil, sightings continued to be reported, often with a sense of dread and wonder. The stories became a fundamental part of the region's folklore, blending the line between myth and reality. What had started as a rural legend was now something more, a shared cultural experience that unified the communities of southern New Jersey, giving them a tale as old and deep as the woods themselves. The legend of the Jersey Devil might have lingered on the fringes of folklore for centuries, but in January 1909, it exploded into the national consciousness. The events of that week, often referred to as the Week of Terror, would solidify the Jersey Devil's reputation as more than just a rural ghost story. It became a phenomenon that captivated newspapers, terrified communities, and left many wondering whether the Pine Barrens really hid something monstrous in its depths. It all began on a cold winter night when a report surfaced from Bristol, Pennsylvania, just across the Delaware River from New Jersey. A man named James Sackville described hearing an unusual noise outside his window, something between a high-pitched scream and a growl. When he looked out into the darkness, he caught a glimpse of a creature like nothing he had ever seen before. A large, winged beast with glowing eyes and a horse-like face. Sackville's report quickly spread, and soon others were coming forward with similar stories. Some described seeing strange tracks in the snow hoof-like prints with an inexplicable stride, indicating that whatever made them had either jumped an impossible distance or taken flight. Within days, reports were coming in from various towns across New Jersey, Philadelphia, and even as far away as Delaware. The newspapers picked up the stories, and sensational headlines screamed about the Jersey Devil's return. Eyewitness accounts described the creature swooping down from rooftops, darting through backyards, and even scratching at doors and windows. People reported livestock disappearing, dogs barking furiously at nothing, and unsettling noises in the dead of night. It seemed as though the entire region was in the grip of some unseen force, and no one felt safe. One of the most widely circulated accounts came from the towns of Haddonfield and Killingswood, New Jersey, where groups of people claimed to have seen the creature firsthand. In Killingswood, it was said to have attacked a trolley car, terrorizing the passengers before vanishing into the night. Witnesses described it as having leathery wings and a long tail, its eyes burning red as it screeched and flapped away. In Haddonfield, a local pastor reportedly saw it perched on the roof of his church, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Though he attempted to get closer, the creature flew off before he could confirm what he had seen. The panic reached its peak when schools closed due to widespread fears, and workers stayed home rather than risk encountering the mysterious beast. The New Jersey police and the local fire departments were flooded with calls. Armed search parties were organized to venture into the Pine Barrens, equipped with rifles and torches. Despite their best efforts, none could find any definitive trace of the Jersey Devil. No lair, no nests, and no captured beast. The only signs of its passage were the peculiar tracks that continued to appear in fields and on rooftops, and occasional, spine-chilling cries that echoed through the night. The 1909 panic also saw a rise in reported close encounters that stretched credulity. For example, one story told of a local woman who claimed to have fended off the creature with a broomstick after it supposedly landed on her roof. Another account came from Camden, New Jersey, where it was said that a police officer fired his revolver at the creature without causing it any harm. In these stories, the Jersey Devil seemed almost supernatural, as if it could not be harmed or captured, a being that defied not only nature, but also the laws of physics. As the panic gripped the region, explanations for the sightings varied wildly. Some people theorized that the creature was a kind of prehistoric animal that had somehow survived extinction. Others suggested it was a mutant born from the swamps of the Pine Barrens, where harsh conditions and isolation might have bred some unknown species. A few more imaginative individuals even suggested it was the vengeful spirit of a long-forgotten Native American shaman, wandering the woods in search of those who had wronged his people. However, the most popular explanation continued to be the traditional folklore surrounding Mother Leeds and her cursed 13th child, who had been transformed into the monstrous Jersey Devil. Skeptics, however, were not so quick to believe. While some of the more sensationalist newspapers ran wild with the stories, others attempted to provide rational explanations for the strange events. They speculated that the sightings were the result of mass hysteria, a kind of collective panic that spread from person to person, inflaming imaginations and leading to exaggerated claims. Some believed that known animals, such as owls or large birds, were being misidentified in the dark, their natural behaviors mistaken for something far more sinister. The peculiar tracks, they suggested, could have been the work of pranksters looking to capitalize on the frenzy. Still, for every skeptic's voice, there seemed to be 2 or 3 believers, each with their own story or testimony. Many of these accounts came from individuals who had no previous interest in the legend and no reason to fabricate such tales. The consistency in descriptions, wings, hoof feet, glowing eyes, and a horse-like face was difficult to dismiss entirely. Even the most level-headed members of the community were left with a lingering doubt, a fear that perhaps there was some truth to the ancient story that had haunted New Jersey for so long. The events of 1909 left a lasting impact on the region. Though no solid evidence was ever found to confirm the existence of the Jersey Devil, the legend was more alive than ever. It had made the leap from local folklore to national attention, capturing the imaginations of people far beyond the Pine Barrens. The panic also left behind a legacy of bizarre folklore and unexplained events. For years afterward, occasional sightings continued to trickle in, often dismissed by authorities, but never completely forgotten by the people. The story of the 1909 Jersey Devil panic has been revisited by historians, folklorists, and cryptozoologists alike. Some researchers have suggested that the surge in sightings could be tied to the socio-political climate of the time, with economic uncertainty and societal changes contributing to the spread of fear. Others have noted that the mass sightings corresponded with a time of significant cultural interest in the supernatural and the unusual, a period when ghost stories, seance practices, and interest in the paranormal were particularly popular in American society. In retrospect, the 1909 panic serves as a fascinating case study in the power of folklore and mass psychology. It demonstrates how stories can take on a life of their own, fueled by fear and imagination. Even without tangible proof, the legend of the Jersey Devil persisted, each retelling a new report adding to the mystery. The events of that fateful January were not just a momentary spectacle. They were a defining chapter in the ongoing tale of the Jersey Devil, forever cementing its place in American folklore. Though the mass hysteria eventually subsided, the question remained: what did people really see? Was there truly a creature lurking in the Pine Barrens, or had the legend simply grown so strong that it could compel people to see what was not there? The answers may never be known, but one thing was certain: the Jersey Devil had become more than just a local legend. It had emerged from the shadows to claim its place in the American imagination, a story that, for one chaotic week in 1909, seemed all too real. After the infamous events of 1909, the legend of the Jersey Devil didn't fade away. It evolved, adapting to changing times and finding a place in the hearts and minds of new generations. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, sightings and encounters continued, adding fresh layers to the lore and keeping the mystery alive. Each account shared enough elements with the original tales to maintain continuity, but the details varied as the Jersey Devil took on new forms in the public's imagination. The Pine Barrens, with its eerie landscapes and isolated expanses, remained a fitting backdrop for modern encounters. In the years following the 1909 panic, The region saw periods of renewed interest whenever a fresh sighting was reported. Some witnesses claimed to have seen the creature flying over the treetops, its dark wings silhouetted against the sky, while others spoke of hearing unsettling sounds that seemed to come from deep within the forest. These accounts often came from locals, hunters, hikers, or drivers who found themselves in the more remote areas. The Pine Barrens, despite its occasional bursts of tourism, retained a sense of foreboding that seemed to invite such stories. One well-known sighting occurred in 1937, when a taxi driver in Salem City reported an encounter with the Jersey Devil. While driving late at night along a rural road, he described seeing a winged creature dart out in front of his vehicle. According to the driver, the beast's eyes glowed in his headlights, and it let out a high-pitched screech before disappearing into the darkness. His account gained some local attention, with skeptics suggesting he had mistaken an owl or large bat for something more sinister. Still, those who were familiar with the legend found his story compelling, as the description matched the creature's classic features: wings, glowing eyes, and an unnatural cry. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the Jersey Devil once again captured public interest. During this era, America's fascination with the strange and unexplained reached new heights, fueled by a cultural interest in UFOs, cryptids, and supernatural phenomena. The Pine Barrens, with its long-standing association with the unknown, became a focus for those interested in such mysteries. Reports emerged of the creature being seen near campgrounds, darting across highways, and even peering into cabin windows late at night. Some visitors to the region claimed to have found odd tracks or heard chilling cries echoing through the forest. The most notable incident of the modern era took place in 1972, when an off-duty police officer in the town of Atco claimed to have come face-to-face with the Jersey Devil. According to the officer, he was driving home late one evening when he saw a creature standing on the side of the road. Its appearance was otherworldly, a horse-like face with glowing red eyes, leathery wings, and a long tail. As he slowed down, the creature suddenly leaped across the road in a single bound, disappearing into the thick forest on the other side. The officer's story was widely circulated, and while it attracted a fair share of skepticism, his reputation as a credible witness added a degree of legitimacy to the account. In the decades that followed, reports of the Jersey Devil became intertwined with local culture, appearing in everything from tourist attractions to sports teams' mascots. The New Jersey hockey team, the Jersey Devils, adopted the creature's name in 1982, cementing the legend as a proud, albeit spooky, part of the state's identity. The story continued to serve as a symbol of the Pine Barrens' mystery and allure, often used as a promotional tool to attract visitors to the area. Festivals, haunted tours, and themed events kept the legend alive, drawing in enthusiasts who were eager to explore the history behind the myth and perhaps even catch a glimpse of the infamous creature themselves. Despite the commercialization of the Jersey Devil, genuine sightings continued to be reported. In 1993, a park ranger in the Wharton State Forest, one of the largest protected areas of the Pine Barrens, claimed to have heard an unnatural wailing sound late at night. The ranger, who was patrolling the forest's more remote trails, said the noise was unlike anything he had ever encountered, even in an area known for its diverse wildlife. The sound, he described, was half scream, half growl, and seemed to come from a place deeper in the woods. Although he never saw the creature that night, the experience left him uneasy, and he made sure to include it in his report. In the 21st century, as technology advanced, sightings of the Jersey Devil began to shift into the realm of social media and digital forms. People shared stories, photos, and videos, claiming to have seen strange creatures in the woods or captured mysterious sounds on audio recordings. While many of these modern accounts were met with skepticism, often dismissed as hoaxes or cases of mistaken identity, The persistent nature of the reports suggested that the legend still had a powerful hold on the public's imagination. Skeptics pointed to the influence of media, the availability of digital editing tools, and the desire for attention as reasons for the increase in reports. However, for some, the similarities between older accounts and new stories raised questions about whether there was still an element of truth behind the legend. The Jersey Devil's role in popular culture has also evolved, appearing in films, television shows, and books. It has been portrayed as everything from a menacing monster to a misunderstood creature struggling for survival in a world that encroaches on its territory. Each depiction adds another layer to the legend, blurring the lines between fact, fiction, and folklore. While some versions stick closely to the traditional accounts of a cursed creature from colonial times, others take creative liberties, reimagining the Jersey Devil as a guardian of the Pine Barrens or a symbol of environmental preservation. These modern interpretations reflect changing attitudes toward nature and the unknown, demonstrating how folklore can adapt to contemporary themes. The Pine Barrens itself, despite becoming more accessible over the years, retains an air of mystery that fuels the legend. Even today, much of the area remains wild and uninhabited, with miles of dense forests, wetlands, and abandoned towns. For those who venture into its depths, the feeling of isolation can be overwhelming, as if stepping back in time to an era when the land was truly untamed. It is easy to see how stories of strange creatures could persist in a place where reality and myth seem to coexist. For many, the Pine Barrens is not just a physical location, but a place where the boundaries between the known and the unknown blur, allowing legends like the Jersey Devil to endure. As new sightings continue to be reported, it remains unclear whether they are simply the product of overactive imaginations, deliberate fabrications, or genuine encounters with something unexplainable. Some researchers continue to investigate the phenomenon, exploring whether the Jersey Devil could be linked to undiscovered species, rare animal mutations, or even psychological effects of the Pine Barrens' unique environment. Others remain convinced that the legend is a cultural artifact, a story that has persisted because it speaks to deeper human fears and the allure of the mysterious. Regardless of its origins, the Jersey Devil remains an iconic part of New Jersey's folklore. It is a reminder that even in an age dominated by science and technology, there are still places where the unexplained can thrive, where stories can become more than just tales told around the campfire. The legend of the Jersey Devil is not merely about a creature lurking in the woods. It is about the enduring power of folklore, the mystery of the Pine Barrens, and the way stories can shape the world around us. As the legend moves further into the digital age, its ability to adapt and endure suggests that the Jersey Devil will continue to haunt the Pine Barrens and the imaginations of those who hear its tale. It is a story that refuses to die, a legend that lives on in the shadowy depths of New Jersey's forests, where even the skeptics may find themselves glancing over their shoulders, just in case. As the legend of the Jersey Devil evolved over the centuries, it became more than just a tale of a creature stalking the Pine Barrens. It emerged as a cultural touchstone that reflected the fears, hopes, and mystery of the region. While modern sightings and stories have added new dimensions to the folklore, the pursuit of truth behind the legend continues. Whether through scholarly research, amateur investigations, or creative reimaginings, the Jersey Devil endures as a powerful symbol of the unknown. In recent decades, various researchers and folklorists have revisited the Jersey Devil legend, seeking to separate fact from fiction. Some have taken an academic approach, exploring the story's historical and cultural origins. They have traced the tale back to colonial times, examining the context in which the legend first emerged. In a time when superstition and religious beliefs heavily influenced daily life, the birth of a devil in a remote area could have served as a cautionary tale about curses or the consequences of going against social norms. Scholars have noted how the Jersey Devil legend may have originated from fears surrounding the natural world, unexplained phenomena, or even as an early form of propaganda to discredit local families or rival settlements. One theory suggests that the original Jersey Devil story was a form of political satire. According to this interpretation, the Leeds family, who were associated with the legend, had a history of conflict with prominent figures in early colonial America. Daniel Leeds, a member of the family, was a well-known Quaker turned Anglican who published almanacs that included astrological symbols and other content considered controversial by the Quaker community. His son, Titan Leeds, later continued the family's publishing business and had a famous feud with Benjamin Franklin, who humorously predicted Titan's death in his own almanac. Some folklorists have proposed that the Leeds family was transformed into the infamous Leeds Devil as a way to mock them or cast aspersions on their character, especially given the family's outsider status in the Quaker-dominated region. As historical research sheds light on the legend's origins, other investigators have focused on the possibility of a real creature behind the sightings. Some cryptozoologists, a group of researchers dedicated to studying unknown animals, have suggested that reports of the Jersey Devil could stem from sightings of an undiscovered species native to the Pine Barrens. They argue that the creature's described features, such as its wings, unusual cries, and peculiar tracks, could be attributed to a large bird or a species of bat not yet documented by science. While the likelihood of such a discovery remains slim, the Pine Barrens' unique environment, with its dense forests and isolated areas, continues to fuel speculation about the existence of hidden wildlife. Another scientific approach has considered the psychological and sociological factors that may explain the persistence of the Jersey Devil legend. Researchers have pointed to the role of mass hysteria, particularly during times of economic or social stress, as a possible explanation for clusters of sightings. For instance, the 1909 panic occurred during a period of industrialization and economic uncertainty in the region, which may have heightened people's fears and made them more susceptible to believing in supernatural occurrences. The human brain's tendency to seek patterns and explanations for the unexplainable could have played a role in turning ordinary events or animal encounters into seemingly paranormal experiences. In addition to academic and scientific efforts, the Jersey Devil has attracted a devoted community of enthusiasts who continue to search for evidence of its existence. Equipped with modern technology, these amateur investigators venture into the Pine Barrens armed with night vision cameras, audio recording equipment, and drones. They document unexplained sounds, strange tracks, and occasionally claim to have captured brief glimpses of shadowy figures. While these investigations have yet to yield definitive proof, the thrill of the hunt and the possibility of uncovering the truth keep the legend alive. The Pine Barrens itself, with its rugged terrain and haunting atmosphere, only adds to the allure of these expeditions. The Jersey Devil has also left a significant impact on local culture, influencing the way people perceive the Pine Barrens and even New Jersey itself. The legend has become a symbol of state pride, embodying the resilience and mystery of a place often overshadowed by its urban reputation. The story has been incorporated into school curriculums, local festivals, and even marketing campaigns, all of which celebrate the state's unique folklore. Many residents see the legend as a reminder of New Jersey's diverse heritage, where history, nature, and myth intersect. Tourism related to the Jersey Devil has grown in popularity, with guided tours, themed attractions, and merchandise contributing to a local industry centered on the legend. The Pine Barrens has become a destination for ghost hunters, nature enthusiasts, and those simply curious about the mysterious creature. However, the commercialization of the legend has led some to question whether the true essence of the folklore is being lost in the pursuit of profit. While the stories continue to attract visitors, some traditionalists worry that the deeper meaning behind the legend Its roots in local history and the interplay between humanity and nature may be overshadowed by sensationalism. The role of the Jersey Devil in media has further complicated its legacy. The creature has appeared in various forms of entertainment, from horror movies and TV shows to comic books and video games. Each portrayal adds a new twist to the story, sometimes transforming the Jersey Devil from a frightening monster into a misunderstood anti-hero or even a victim of circumstance. These creative retellings highlight the legend's adaptability, demonstrating how folklore can evolve to suit contemporary audiences. At the same time, they can blur the line between the original story and modern interpretations, making it difficult to distinguish fact from fiction. For those who live near or frequently visit the Pine Barrens, the Jersey Devil remains an ever-present element of the local landscape. Even among skeptics, the legend is acknowledged with a sense of respect, if only for its place in the region's history. Residents sometimes share stories passed down through generations, often in a tone that mixes humor with an underlying hint of unease. While many don't truly believe in the existence of the Jersey Devil, there's still a quiet recognition that the Pine Barrens can be an eerie place, especially at night. The dense forest, the remote trails, and the sounds of unseen wildlife create an atmosphere where the legend feels almost plausible. As the Jersey Devil legend continues to grow, it serves as a testament to the enduring power of storytelling. The creature's tale has outlasted generations, evolving with each new account while remaining rooted in the core elements that first made it compelling. The Jersey Devil is a reminder of the human fascination with the unknown, a symbol of the mysteries that still exist in a world often thought to be fully explored. It shows how folklore can capture the collective imagination, inspiring both fear and wonder. The search for the Jersey Devil is not merely about finding a physical creature. It's about exploring the human desire to uncover the unexplained, to connect with the past, and to find meaning in the natural world. Whether the Jersey Devil is real or a product of folklore may ultimately be less important than the legend's impact on the culture and identity of New Jersey. As long as there are stories to tell and mysteries to ponder, the Jersey Devil will remain a vital part of the state's folklore, casting its shadow over the Pine Barrens and inviting future generations to delve into its story. The legend, whether approached with belief or skepticism, teaches that some mysteries may never be fully solved, and that's where their magic lies. The Jersey Devil's tale has transcended its origins, becoming a legend that continues to fascinate, challenge, and inspire. Even as the world changes, the Pine Barrens will always be a place where one can hear whispers of something beyond understanding, where the Jersey Devil still roams in the imaginations of all who dare to wonder what might be lurking just out of sight. Hill House stood alone, dark and foreboding against the backdrop of the hills. It loomed over the landscape like a forgotten giant, its jagged edges cutting sharply into the sky. For decades, rumors of its malevolence spread far and wide. People spoke in whispers about the strange happenings within its walls, events that no one could quite explain. Now, it was about to host a new group of visitors, each with their own reasons for being drawn to the house's mystery. Little did they know, they would leave with much more than they expected. Dr. John Montague, a scholar of the supernatural, was the one who had orchestrated this visit. A methodical man with a quiet obsession, he had spent years collecting accounts of haunted places, but Hill House was different. It had a reputation that made even the most hardened skeptics shudder. It wasn't just another haunted house. It was something worse, something alive in its own way. Dr. Montague believed that if he could document its phenomena, he would finally have the proof he needed to establish his theories on the supernatural. The doctor had invited 3 others to accompany him for the summer. Eleanor Vance was the first to accept the invitation. She was a woman who, for most of her life, had been invisible to the world. At 32, Eleanor had spent her youth caring for her ailing mother in a life of solitude. When her mother passed, Eleanor was left with nothing but her bitterness and regret. The invitation from Dr. Montague offered her something she had never had: an escape. Eleanor had no home to speak of, no career, and no one waiting for her anywhere. The idea of escaping the Hill House, even with its dark reputation, was better than returning to her sister's house, where she was nothing more than an unwanted burden. As she drove through the countryside, Eleanor felt a rush of exhilaration, a fleeting sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. But as the miles disappeared behind her and Hill House drew nearer, an uneasy feeling began to creep in. The second guest was Theodora, an artist with a sharp wit and a tendency to hide her true emotions behind laughter and sarcasm. She was everything Eleanor wasn't: confident, carefree, and vibrant. Dr. Montague had chosen her because of her supposed psychic sensitivity, although Theodora never took such things seriously. For her, this was just another adventure, a way to pass the time during the summer. Luke Sanderson, the final member of the group, was the heir to Hill House. Though he had never set foot inside it before, Luke wasn't thrilled about spending his time in a place everyone in his family avoided. But he was obliged to join the others, both because it was his inheritance and because his aunt insisted. To him, Hill House was simply an old structure, nothing more. He wasn't particularly interested in the supernatural, but he wasn't about to turn down the opportunity to meet new people and enjoy some good company. The three guests arrived separately, each with their own expectations, but all were struck by the sight of Hill House when they first laid eyes on it. Its towering walls seemed to lean toward them, as if they were being drawn into its grasp. The house was more than just unsettling. It was wrong in some unspoken way. The architecture was deliberately designed to disorient, with sharp angles and strange curves that made the house feel unnatural. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, ready to trap anyone foolish enough to step inside. Eleanor was the first to arrive, her heart pounding as she approached the iron gates. She hesitated, gripping the wheel of her car tightly. Her first instinct was to turn back, to leave Hill House and never look back. But something kept her there. Perhaps it was her longing for a place where she could belong, or perhaps it was something darker, an unspoken pull from the house itself. With a deep breath, Eleanor pushed forward, driving through the gates and up the gravel road toward the house. As she parked and stepped out of the car, the stillness of the place enveloped her. No birds sang, no wind stirred the trees. It was as if the house existed in a world separate from everything else. As she made her way to the entrance, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, and she was greeted by Mrs. Dudley, the housekeeper, a doorwoman with a cold demeanor. Mrs. Dudley made it clear that she had no interest in the guests or their experiments. She had one job: to keep the house running, and she wasn't going to stick around after dark. "I leave before nightfall," she said flatly, her voice devoid of emotion. "No one stays after dark." Eleanor shivered, unsure if the warning was meant for her or if it was just Mrs. Dudley's way of doing things. Either way, the message was clear. Hill House had its own rules, and the living didn't belong there once the sun went down. Soon after, Theodora and Luke arrived, both of them trying to mask their unease with light conversation. Dr. Montague greeted them warmly, his excitement barely contained. This was the beginning of his great experiment, and he was certain that Hill House would deliver the proof he sought. Together, the group explored the house, marveling at its grand but unsettling design. Every room felt wrong. The proportions were slightly off, and the angles made them feel like they were being watched. As night fell, the group gathered in the parlor, ready for the first of many nights at Hill House. Outside, the sun disappeared behind the hills, casting long shadows across the house. Inside, the air grew colder, and a heavy silence settled over them. Eleanor felt it first, a sense of dread creeping up her spine, as if the house was slowly closing in around her. She glanced at Theodora, who smiled, seemingly unaffected, but Eleanor could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. Luke, too, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Dr. Montague's voice broke the silence. "Welcome to Hill House," he said softly, "and may whatever walks here walk alone." But Eleanor knew, deep down, that they were never truly alone. Not in Hill House. The house had been waiting. The first night at Hill House was quiet, unnervingly so. No disturbances, no cold drafts, no ghostly whispers. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press in on all sides. For the group, this silence felt like a reprieve, though none of them voiced their relief aloud. Dr. Montague had warned them that the house would take time to reveal its secrets, and so they settled into the routine of exploring the mansion, observing its strange features, and waiting for something to happen. Eleanor, in particular, was on edge. She had expected immediate signs of the supernatural, perhaps a door slamming on its own, or the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. But Hill House didn't offer any such obvious signs. Instead, it exerted a quieter, more insidious influence. There was something unsettling in the air, something unseen yet always present. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, biding its time. Theodora, ever the optimist, treated the situation lightly. She made jokes to ease the tension, poking fun at the house's ominous reputation. "I was expecting more theatrics," she said one morning over breakfast. "A little poltergeist action, at least." Eleanor smiled, grateful for the attempt at levity, but the nagging sense of dread in the pit of her stomach never fully went away. Theodora seemed so at ease, but Eleanor wondered if it was just a mask to hide her own unease. Luke, on the other hand, appeared disinterested. He spent his time lounging around, flipping through old books he found in the library, or lazily inspecting the rooms. For him, this was nothing more than a bizarre vacation, and his carefree attitude irritated Eleanor. How could he be so indifferent when Hill House felt so palpably dangerous? Dr. Montague remained the most focused. He wandered the halls with his notebook, jotting down every strange detail, even if it was nothing more than a creaky floorboard or a faint change in temperature. He believed that the house would eventually begin to manifest its true nature, and he was determined not to miss a single moment. The doctor's presence reassured Eleanor, but only slightly. His rational explanations provided a counterbalance to her growing anxiety. But as each day passed, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was suddenly changing inside her. As the days turned into nights, the group began to notice the small, almost imperceptible oddities that defined Hill House. The doors never stayed open, no matter how wide they were left. They always swung shut with a soft click, as if the house refused to let the outside world in. The angles of the rooms felt wrong, the corners too sharp or too curved, creating a sense of disorientation. At times, the halls seemed to stretch longer than they had before, as though the house were shifting itself around them. Eleanor found herself strangely drawn to the house, as if it were calling to her in some silent way. She would wander the halls alone, feeling a connection to the mansion she couldn't explain. The house's dark wood paneling and intricate carvings seemed to pulse with a life of their own. There were moments when Eleanor felt almost comforted by the oppressive stillness, as though Hill House understood her in a way no one else ever had. But along with that comfort came a growing sense of unease. Each night, Eleanor would wake in her bed, heart racing, convinced that someone or something was standing just outside her door. She would lie there, frozen, listening to the silence, trying to convince herself it was all in her mind. But the feeling of being watched never left her. The others began to feel it too. One evening, as they sat in the parlor, Theodora broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Does anyone else feel like the house is staring at us?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Luke raised an eyebrow, glancing around. "I wouldn't say staring," he replied. "But there's definitely something strange about this place." Dr. Montague nodded thoughtfully, as if he had expected this. "Hill House is known for its ability to influence," he said carefully. "It's not always about what you can see or hear. The house affects you in subtle ways. You might feel watched or uneasy, but it's all part of the experience. We must remain objective." Objective. Eleanor clung to that word, but it felt hollow. How could she remain objective when the walls themselves seemed to be closing in on her? She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, yet Hill House was doing something to her, something that made her question everything she thought she knew. The next night, the disturbances began in earnest. It started with a loud banging sound echoing through the house. The group was gathered in the parlor when the noise rang out, startling them all. Theodora jumped, knocking over a teacup, while Luke muttered a curse under his breath. Dr. Montague stood, listening carefully. "Did you hear where it came from?" he asked, his voice tense. Eleanor shook her head, her heart pounding. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating off the walls. Another bang followed, then another, growing louder and more insistent. The sound was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard, deep, guttural, and impossibly loud, as if the house itself was groaning in pain. "Stay together," Dr. Montague instructed, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. They huddled together, listening as the noise continued to echo through the halls. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel her pulse racing, her skin cold with fear. She wanted to believe it was just a structural issue old houses creaked, after all, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Hill House was waking up, and it was starting to reach out. That night, the group decided to retire early, but sleep was elusive. Eleanor lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to sleep, but the unease lingered. It was then that she heard a soft voice, barely audible, calling her name. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Eleanor," it whispered, gentle yet insistent. Her eyes flew open, and she sat up in bed, heart pounding. The voice was coming from outside her door, just beyond the threshold. She swallowed, gripping the edges of the blanket tightly. Was someone playing a cruel trick on her, or was this the house? The possibility of either terrified her. She stayed frozen in bed, unable to move, until the voice faded into the silence once more. The fear lingered, even after the sound was gone, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house had spoken to her personally, intimately, in a way that no one else had experienced. Hill House was no longer just a house. It was something more, something alive, and Eleanor feared it had chosen her. The first night at Hill House was quiet, unnervingly so. No disturbances, no cold drafts, no ghostly whispers. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press in on all sides. For the group, this silence felt like a reprieve, though none of them voiced their relief aloud. Dr. Montague had warned them that the house would take time to reveal its secrets, and so they settled into the routine of exploring the mansion, observing its strange features, and waiting for something to happen. Eleanor, in particular, was on edge. She had expected immediate signs of the supernatural, perhaps a door slamming on its own, or the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. But Hill House didn't offer any such obvious signs. Instead, it exerted a quieter, more insidious influence. There was something unsettling in the air, something unseen yet always present. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, biding its time. Theodora, ever the optimist, treated the situation lightly. She made jokes to ease the tension, poking fun at the house's ominous reputation. "I was expecting more theatrics," she said one morning over breakfast. "A little poltergeist action, at least." Eleanor smiled, grateful for the attempt at levity, but the nagging sense of dread in the pit of her stomach never fully went away. Theodora seemed so at ease, but Eleanor wondered if it was just a mask to hide her own unease. Luke, on the other hand, appeared disinterested. He spent his time lounging around, flipping through old books he found in the library, or lazily inspecting the rooms. For him, this was nothing more than a bizarre vacation, and his carefree attitude irritated Eleanor. How could he be so indifferent when Hill House felt so palpably dangerous? Dr. Montague remained the most focused. He wandered the halls with his notebook, jotting down every strange detail, even if it was nothing more than a creaky floorboard or a faint change in temperature. He believed that the house would eventually begin to manifest its true nature, and he was determined not to miss a single moment. The doctor's presence reassured Eleanor, but only slightly. His rational explanations provided a counterbalance to her growing anxiety. But as each day passed, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly changing inside her. As the days turned into nights, the group began to notice the small, almost imperceptible oddities that defined Hill House. The doors never stayed open, no matter how wide they were left. They always swung shut with a soft click, as if the house refused to let the outside world in. The angles of the rooms felt wrong, the corners too sharp or too curved, creating a sense of disorientation. At times, the halls seemed to stretch longer than they had before, as though the house were shifting itself around them. Eleanor found herself strangely drawn to the house, as if it were calling to her in some silent way. She would wander the halls alone, feeling a connection to the mansion she couldn't explain. The house's dark wood paneling and intricate carvings seemed to pulse with a life of their own. There were moments when Eleanor felt almost comforted by the oppressive stillness, as though Hill House understood her in a way no one else ever had. But along with that comfort came a growing sense of unease. Each night, Eleanor would wake in her bed, heart racing, convinced that someone or something was standing just outside her door. She would lie there, frozen, listening to the silence, trying to convince herself it was all in her mind. But the feeling of being watched never left her. The others began to feel it too. One evening, as they sat in the parlor, Theodora broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Does anyone else feel like the house is staring at us?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Luke raised an eyebrow, glancing around. "I wouldn't say staring," he replied, "but there's definitely something strange about this place." Dr. Montague nodded thoughtfully, as if he had expected this. "Hill House is known for its ability to influence," he said carefully. "It's not always about what you can see or hear. The house affects you in subtle ways. You might feel watched or uneasy, but it's all part of the experience. We must remain objective." Objective. Eleanor clung to that word, but it felt hollow. How could she remain objective when the walls themselves seemed to be closing in on her? She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, yet Hill House was doing something to her, something that made her question everything she thought she knew. The next night, the disturbances began in earnest. It started with a loud banging sound, echoing through the house. The group was gathered in the parlor when the noise rang out, startling them all. Theodora jumped, knocking over her teacup, while Luke muttered a curse under his breath. Dr. Montague stood, listening carefully. "Did you hear where it came from?" he asked, his voice tense. Eleanor shook her head, her heart pounding. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating off the walls. Another bang followed, then another, growing louder and more insistent. The sound was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard, deep, guttural, and impossibly loud, as if the house itself was groaning in pain. "Stay together," Dr. Montague instructed, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. They huddled together, listening as the noise continued to echo through the halls. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel her pulse racing, her skin cold with fear. She wanted to believe it was just a structural issue old houses creaked. After all, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Hill House was waking up, and it was starting to reach out. That night, the group decided to retire early, but sleep was elusive. Eleanor lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to sleep, but the unease lingered. It was then that she heard a soft voice, barely audible, calling her name. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the voice came again, clearer this time. Eleanor. It whispered, gentle yet insistent. Her eyes flew open, and she sat up in bed, heart pounding. The voice was coming from outside her door, just beyond the threshold. She swallowed, gripping the edges of the blanket tightly. Was someone playing a cruel trick on her, or was this the house? The possibility of either terrified her. She stayed frozen in bed, unable to move, until the voice faded into the silence once more. The fear lingered, even after the sound was gone, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house had spoken to her personally, intimately, in a way that no one else had experienced. Hill House was no longer just a house. It was something more, something alive, and Eleanor feared it had chosen her. The days in Hill House began to blur, each one bleeding into the next. The once playful atmosphere among the group had grown tense, weighed down by the increasing strangeness that seemed to infest every corner of the mansion. The subtle disturbances that had started with noises and inexplicable cold spots were now escalating into something far more sinister. Eleanor felt it most acutely. Each night, her dreams became more vivid, more disorienting. Shadows danced across her room, and she swore she could hear whispers, the same voice that had called her name that first night. The voice no longer startled her, though. Ugh. Instead, she found herself listening for it, waiting for it to speak again. And when it did, it was almost comforting, as though the house understood her deepest thoughts and longings. But that comfort came with a price. Hill House was changing Eleanor. Where once she had been shy, withdrawn, and uncertain, now she felt a strange, dark confidence creeping in. It wasn't the kind of confidence that made her feel stronger. It was more like a weight pressing down on her, pushing her to let go of her old self. Every time she wandered the house alone, she felt it pulling her further into its grasp, as if it were slowly becoming a part of her. The others noticed the change in her, but no one spoke of it directly. Theodora, ever sensitive to the emotions of those around her, had grown distant from Eleanor. Where they once shared a bond, an unspoken tension now lingered between them. Theodora still laughed and joked, but her gaze had become sharp, suspicious. She was watching Eleanor carefully, as if she were afraid of what her friend might do, or perhaps of what the house might do to her. One evening, as they gathered in the parlor, Theodora finally confronted Eleanor, though her words were veiled in humor. "You're looking a little pale, Eleanor," she said with a playful smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hill House isn't agreeing with you, is it?" Eleanor bristled at the comment, her nerves already frayed from the sleepless nights and the constant feeling of being watched. "I'm fine," she snapped, more harshly than she intended. She immediately regretted it, but the words were out, and she saw the flicker of surprise and perhaps fear in Theodora's expression. Dr. Montague, ever the mediator, stepped in to ease the tension. "We're all under a lot of stress," he said calmly. "Hill House has a way of playing tricks on the mind. It's important that we stick together and not let the house influence us. But even as he spoke, the house seemed to respond. A loud, hollow knock echoed through the walls, as if something was rapping on the wood from within. The noise reverberated through the room, freezing them in place. Eleanor's heart pounded as she listened. It wasn't just a random sound. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost as if someone or something was trying to get in. Luke, who had been lounging carelessly in his chair, jumped to his feet, his face pale. What the hell was that? He muttered, his usual nonchalance gone. Dr. Montague motioned for calm, but the tension was thick in the air. Everyone stay together, he ordered. We've prepared for this. It's just the house. It's reacting to us. Reacting. Eleanor felt the word sink into her mind like a stone. The house wasn't just reacting, it was communicating. She could feel it. It was reaching out, trying to make contact, and she was the one it had chosen. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. The group huddled closer together, their fear palpable. For a moment, Eleanor felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to escape the house's grasp and never look back. But even as the thought crossed her mind, another voice, her own, but darker, quieter, whispered inside her. This is where you belong. Don't leave, not yet. The noise abruptly stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The group sat frozen, their breaths shallow, waiting for the next attack, but nothing came. After what felt like hours, Dr. Montague finally spoke. It's over for now, he said, though his voice was tense. We need to stay vigilant. The house is testing us. They retired to their rooms early that night, though none of them expected to sleep. Eleanor lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the evening replaying in her mind. The knocking, the tension, Theodora's strange look, all of it felt like a warning. But from whom? From the house? Or from herself? Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and filled with disturbing dreams. Eleanor found herself wandering through the dark corridors of Hill House, but the walls were different, now closer, more confining. They seemed to pulse with life, breathing in sync with her own panicked breaths. As she walked, the floor shifted beneath her feet, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. In her dream, the house whispered to her again, that same familiar voice. You can't leave, Eleanor. You don't want to. This is where you're meant to be. She awoke in a cold sweat, her heart racing. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, the dream still clinging to her like a second skin. The room was dark, the shadows deep and unfamiliar, but the overwhelming sense of being watched was all too real. Eleanor glanced at the door. It was closed, just as she had left it, but something was wrong. She could feel it. Slowly, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cold floor. She stood, hesitating for a moment, then moved toward the door, her heart pounding in her ears. When she opened it, the hallway stretched out before her, empty and silent. But the moment she stepped outside, she felt the temperature drop. The cold wrapped around her like a tight grip, and the air seemed to hum with a low, steady vibration. She wasn't alone. Something was out there, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. The whisper came again, soft but insistent. Come closer, Eleanor. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her body felt frozen, as if the house had taken control of her limbs, holding her in place. The whisper grew louder, more demanding, as if it were coming from inside her own mind. Closer. Eleanor clenched her fists, fighting the urge to move, to obey. But the pull was too strong. She took one step forward, then another, her feet moving of their own accord. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, growing darker, thicker, until they almost swallowed her whole. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the feeling vanished. The cold dissipated, the air returned to normal, and Eleanor was left standing in the middle of the hallway, trembling. She didn't know how long she stood there, but when she finally gathered the strength to return to her room, she collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and terrified. The next morning, she told no one what had happened. Not Theodora, not Dr. Montague, not even Luke, who seemed as unaffected by the house as ever. But Eleanor knew that something inside her had changed. The house had touched her, reached into her mind, and planted a seed of doubt that was slowly growing. Hill House was no longer just a building. It was something more, a living entity, feeding off their fear, twisting their thoughts, and slowly unraveling their sense of reality. And Eleanor, whether she admitted it or not, was becoming part of it. By the time the fourth week in Hill House arrived, the atmosphere had shifted from eerie to oppressive. Every inch of the house seemed charged with a malevolent energy that none of them could fully explain. No longer content with subtle whispers and cold drafts, the house had grown more active, more aggressive. It was as if the mansion itself was waking up, and its attention was fixed on Eleanor. Theodora, once a source of comfort with her sharp wit and playful teasing, now kept her distance from Eleanor. The tension between them was palpable, and Eleanor couldn't ignore the feeling that Theodora was afraid of her, or rather, of what the house was doing to her. The unspoken barrier between them only made Eleanor feel more isolated, more trapped in her own mind. She began to question whether Theodora had ever truly been her friend, or if she had just been pretending all along. Luke, who had never taken the haunting seriously, was becoming more and more irritable. His usual carefree attitude had given way to frustration, and he spent much of his time pacing through the house, as though he was searching for an escape. But there was no escape, not from Hill House. The mansion's strange geometry seemed to twist and turn in on itself, making the corridors feel endless and the rooms disorienting. Even when they tried to leave, the house had a way of leading them back inside. Dr. Montague was still focused on his research, scribbling notes with frantic determination. But even he was beginning to show signs of strain. His once calm demeanor had cracked, revealing the deep anxiety beneath. The house was proving more powerful than he had anticipated, and though he tried to maintain a scientific detachment, it was clear that Hill House had shaken him. He had lost control of the experiment, and he knew it. Eleanor, meanwhile, was slipping further into the house's grip. Her dreams had become darker, more vivid, and the line between reality and imagination was blurring. She could no longer tell if the strange things she was experiencing were real, or if the house was playing tricks on her mind. The whispers had become more frequent, more persistent, and they no longer scared her. In fact, she had started to listen to them, to find comfort in their words. They understand me. The house understands me. It was a dangerous thought, but Eleanor couldn't help it. The more isolated she felt from the others, the more she turned to the house for comfort. It whispered to her, telling her that she belonged there, that she didn't need the others. And Eleanor began to believe it. One night, after another unsettling evening filled with unexplained noises and shifting shadows, Eleanor found herself wandering the halls of Hill House alone. She didn't know what had drawn her out of bed. Perhaps it was the pull of the house, or perhaps it was her own restless mind. Either way, she found herself moving through the mansion's darkened corridors, the wooden floorboards creaking softly beneath her feet. The house seemed to breathe around her, its very walls pulsating with a strange energy. Eleanor felt calm, almost serene, as if she were finally where she was meant to be. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Truly seen. She came to a door at the end of the hallway, one she had never noticed before. It was slightly ajar, as if inviting her inside. Without hesitation, she pushed it open and stepped into the room beyond. It was a small, dimly lit space with a single window that looked out over the dark, empty grounds of Hill House. The air in the room was cold, but Eleanor didn't feel the chill. Instead, she felt a strange warmth radiating from the center of the room. There, in the middle of the floor, was a mirror. Its surface was cracked, the fractured glass reflecting distorted images of the room and of Eleanor herself. She stepped closer, staring at her reflection. Her face looked pale, drawn, and tired, but there was something else in her eyes, something dark and unfamiliar. The mirror whispered to her, "You don't need them. They're holding you back. You've always been alone, Eleanor, but here, you can be free. You can be yourself." Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the mirror's cracked surface. The moment her fingers brushed the glass, she felt a surge of energy course through her. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming, like the house itself was pouring its power into her. For a brief, terrifying moment, Eleanor felt as though she were losing herself. The weight of her loneliness, her grief, her anger, it all pressed down on her, threatening to consume her. But the house whispered again, soothing her. "Let go, Eleanor. Let go of who you were. Be free." And she did. In that moment, standing before the cracked mirror, Eleanor let go. She let go of the years she had spent caring for her mother, of the bitterness and resentment that had built up inside her. She let go of the shame, the regret, the feeling of being invisible. And as she did, she felt something shift within her, something dark, something powerful. The house had given her a gift. It had taken her pain, her loneliness, and turned it into something else, something stronger. When Eleanor returned to the others the next morning, they noticed the change immediately. Her demeanor was different, calmer, more assured, but there was something unsettling about the way she carried herself. Theodora watched her with wary eyes, while Luke seemed to avoid her altogether. Even Dr. Montague appeared unnerved, though he said nothing. That day, the disturbances escalated. The walls groaned under an invisible pressure, and strange, unexplainable phenomena occurred throughout the house. Doors slammed shut with deafening force, and objects moved on their own. It was as if Hill House was coming alive, feeding off the group's fear and uncertainty. And through it all, Eleanor remained calm. She no longer felt afraid of the house. She felt connected to it. The house had chosen her, and she had accepted it. But Theodora wasn't fooled. That evening, as they sat together in the parlor, Theodora turned to Eleanor, her voice low and tense. "What's happening to you?" she asked. Her eyes narrowed. "You're not the same, Eleanor. You're different." Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't the warm, shy smile she had once worn. It was something colder, more distant. "I'm fine," she said softly. "I've just realized something, that's all." Theodora shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "This house is doing something to you. It's trying to take you. Don't you see that?" Eleanor's smile faded. "Maybe I don't want to leave," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe this is where I belong." Theodora stared at her, horrified. "Eleanor, no. This isn't you. The house is manipulating you." But Eleanor had stopped listening. The house's whispers were louder now, drowning out Theodora's voice. "You don't need her. She's afraid of you. She'll never understand." And Eleanor believed it. She no longer needed the others. Hill House had given her something far more valuable, a sense of belonging, a place where she could finally be free. The cracks that had formed in her mind were spreading, and Eleanor could feel herself slipping further and further into the house's grasp. She didn't fight it. In the days that followed, the manifestations grew more violent. The house was unraveling, its dark energy seeping into every corner, every crevice. The others tried to reason with Eleanor, to pull her back, but it was too late. Hill House had claimed her, and she had let it. The house had become her refuge, her sanctuary, and she wasn't going to leave. Not ever. The final days in Hill House were a descent into chaos. The mansion, once eerie but manageable, now seemed intent on consuming those within it. Every room, every hallway felt alive with a malevolent energy that no one could ignore. The subtle games Hill House had played, the knocks, the whispers were gone. Now it was a full assault. The house wanted them out. Or worse, it wanted to trap them there forever. Eleanor had fully surrendered to its pull. Her connection to the house had deepened to the point where she could no longer tell where she ended and Hill House began. The whispers that had once haunted her in the dark now filled her mind even in the daylight. They were no longer warnings or invitations. They were commands, insistent and relentless. Stay. You belong here. Let go of everything else. This is your home. Dr. Montague was the first to openly acknowledge the danger Eleanor was in. His once scientific curiosity had turned into concern. "We need to leave," he said to the group, his voice strained with the realization that he had lost control of the situation. "The house is becoming dangerous, especially for Eleanor. It's influencing her, perhaps more than we understand." But Eleanor wasn't listening. She was sitting by the window, gazing out into the bleak, foggy landscape that surrounded Hill House. Her expression was distant, almost peaceful, as though she was no longer part of the conversation. In her mind, the house was all that mattered. The outside world had become irrelevant. Theodora's patience had long since run out. "We can't just sit here and watch this happen," she snapped, her usual sharpness undercut by real fear. She glanced over at Eleanor, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and concern. She's not herself anymore. The house has taken her, and we have to do something. Luke, standing near the door, looked ready to leave at any moment. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fear that he couldn't shake. "We've stayed too long," he muttered. "We need to get out while we still can." But Eleanor wasn't leaving. She had made that clear. And more than that, the house wouldn't let her go. The others could sense it. Hill House had its grip on her, and it wasn't about to loosen. That night, the house showed its full power. The walls shook, the floors groaned, and doors slammed with a force that rattled the entire structure. It felt like the house was coming apart at the seams, but instead of fear, Eleanor felt exhilaration. The house was alive, and it was speaking to her. It wanted her. As the others scrambled in panic, trying to figure out whether to flee or huddle together in safety, Eleanor moved calmly through the chaos. The shadows seemed to reach for her, embracing her as she walked through the darkened halls. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, but they no longer frightened her. "You're home, Eleanor. This is where you've always belonged." The others tried to stop her. Theodora reached for her arm, pleading with her to come back to reality. But Eleanor pulled away with a strength that startled her friend. Dr. Montague tried to reason with her, his voice breaking with desperation, but his words didn't reach her. Luke, too scared to even approach her, watched from a distance, his face pale and drawn. Eleanor moved toward the grand staircase, her steps slow and deliberate. The house had led her there, guiding her to this final moment. The staircase loomed before her, a towering symbol of the house's power. She could feel the air around her vibrating with energy, as if the house itself was alive, watching her every move. As she stood at the top of the stairs, the voices filled her mind completely. "End it here, Eleanor. This is your final step. It's the only way to be free." For a brief moment, Eleanor hesitated. She looked down at the others below, their faces filled with horror and helplessness. But their fear felt distant to her now. The house had become her reality, and the people she once called friends were just shadows in her mind. Then, without another thought, Eleanor let herself go. But as she took the step forward, something in her shifted. A small, quiet voice her own fought its way through the cacophony of whispers. "Is this really what I want?" For a moment, Eleanor faltered. The house seemed to tighten its grip, but her mind, buried deep beneath the house's influence, was fighting back. She thought of the life she had left behind lonely, yes, but still hers. She remembered the kindness of strangers, the feeling of sunlight on her face, the warmth of a world beyond Hill House. Was it really too late to turn back? But the house was relentless. There is no turning back. This is where you belong. You can't escape now. The others watched in horror as Eleanor wavered at the top of the staircase. Dr. Montague shouted her name, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. Theodora cried out, rushing toward the stairs, but Luke held her back, too afraid of what Eleanor might do. And then, with a final, shattering cry, Eleanor stepped forward. The house roared around her as she fell. Time seemed to slow as she tumbled down the stairs, her body twisting in the air. The others rushed to her, their footsteps pounding against the floor as they raced to catch her. But it was too late. Eleanor lay crumpled at the base of the staircase, her eyes closed, her body still. For a moment, there was only silence. The house, as if satisfied, seemed to calm. The groaning walls, the slamming doors, they all stopped. Hill House was still, as though it had finally taken what it wanted. Dr. Montague knelt beside Eleanor, his hand shaking as he checked for signs of life. Theodora stood frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. Luke hovered nearby, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a hollow fear. But Eleanor was alive. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, and for a brief moment, she looked at the others as though seeing them for the first time in weeks. Her voice, weak but clear, broke the silence. I'm sorry, she whispered. The house remained quiet as they gathered her up, carrying her carefully to her room. The others didn't speak, their minds too overwhelmed by what had happened. Eleanor, too weak to stand, allowed herself to be led away. As she lay in bed that night, her body aching, her mind exhausted, Eleanor finally understood. Hill House had tried to take her, but something within her had resisted. She had come to the edge, looked into the abyss, and somehow she had pulled back. For now, but the house wasn't done with her. She could still feel its pull, still hear its whispers in the back of her mind. The fight wasn't over, and Eleanor knew it. Hill House was a living thing, and it didn't let go easily. As the house settled into its familiar, oppressive silence, Eleanor closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would leave. She had to. But part of her wondered if she would ever truly be free of Hill House, or if it had already taken more of her than she realized. Anneliese Michel grew up in a small Bavarian village in post-war Germany, surrounded by the strong influence of the Catholic Church. From an early age, her life revolved around prayer, religious education, and a deep sense of devotion. Her parents, devout Catholics, believed that faith was the foundation of a moral life, and Anneliese embraced their teachings wholeheartedly. However, beneath the surface of this pious upbringing was a persistent pressure to achieve spiritual perfection, a burden she would carry throughout her short life. By the time she reached her teenage years, Anneliese felt an overwhelming sense of duty to live righteously. She avoided anything that might be considered sinful and constantly worried that her thoughts or actions might offend God. This need to be good was not just about faith. It became a source of intense anxiety. The line between religious devotion and fear of divine punishment grew thinner with each passing day. She confessed her sins frequently, sometimes obsessing over minor mistakes, such as missing a prayer or feeling envy toward a friend. To her, these slip-ups felt like betrayals, not just to God, but to herself. Her struggles with self-worth deepened when, at the age of 16, she experienced her first medical episode. During school, she suddenly lost control of her body, collapsing in a fit of convulsions. Confused and frightened, Anneliese woke up in the hospital, where doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological disorder known to cause seizures, memory lapses, and hallucinations. Although the doctors assured her that medication would manage her symptoms, Annalise sensed that her suffering had a deeper meaning. Why, she wondered, was she being afflicted this way? Had she somehow failed God? Despite taking prescribed anti-seizure medication, her symptoms persisted. Annalise began to experience terrifying visual disturbances, shadowy figures that would appear in her bedroom, whispering cruel words she couldn't ignore. Sometimes, these hallucinations made her question if the people around her were really there. These experiences were deeply unsettling, leaving her exhausted and anxious. She isolated herself, withdrawing from social activities, fearful of judgment and embarrassment. Her parents, initially hopeful that treatment would improve her condition, grew increasingly concerned. Her inner turmoil also led to unsettling behaviors. At first, she simply punished herself for perceived failings, praying for hours without rest, or kneeling on hard surfaces until her knees were bruised. However, as her mental state deteriorated, these behaviors grew more extreme. She would wake up in the middle of the night and intentionally sleep on the cold floor, believing it was a form of penance. Other times, she deprived herself of basic comforts, like food and warmth, convinced that she needed to suffer to purify her soul. As the seizures and hallucinations continued, Annelise's sense of identity became increasingly fragmented. She began questioning if she was cursed or if an evil presence had taken root within her. The medical explanations offered little comfort. How could something as clinical as a brain disorder account for the overwhelming darkness that haunted her mind? To Annalise, her suffering felt like a spiritual battle, a test from God that she had to endure, no matter the cost. As Annalise entered adulthood, her mental and physical state deteriorated rapidly. The seizures became more frequent, and no combination of medications seemed to control them. But what disturbed her most were the terrifying visions and voices that invaded her mind. These were not just hallucinations. She believed they carried a message, one that filled her with fear. At first, it was the faint sound of whispers, but soon they grew louder and more hostile. The voices accused her of being unworthy, insisting she was beyond redemption. They told her she had failed, that her soul was lost. The once devout girl, who had cherished her faith, began to experience deep confusion. Praying, which had once given her comfort, now seemed impossible. The voices mocked her when she tried, telling her that God no longer listened. She avoided church, even tearing up prayer cards and damaging crucifixes in frustration. It was as if everything sacred that had once anchored her life now felt distant and unreachable. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. In moments of panic, she would lash out, not knowing how to cope with the overpowering emotions inside her. She withdrew from her family, spending long hours alone in her room, unable to find peace. Sometimes she would pace back and forth or sit for hours in silence, lost in the storm of thoughts that never seemed to quiet. What frightened her most was the sense that she no longer had control over herself. Her family tried their best to help, but the changes in Annalise were overwhelming. She refused to eat regular meals, not because of a lack of hunger, but because she believed that depriving herself was the only way to cleanse her spirit. The voices told her that she did not deserve comfort or nourishment. She began to experience strange impulses, behaviors she couldn't explain but felt compelled to follow. She might suddenly throw herself to the ground, feeling as though her body was not her own to command. Night after night, her sleep was interrupted by vivid nightmares of grotesque creatures and apocalyptic visions. Some nights she awoke in tears, convinced that her prayers had damned her instead of saved her. Other times she felt a compulsion to make herself physically uncomfortable, lying on the cold floor despite the warmth of her bed, or kneeling for hours until her legs trembled. These acts were not intended to harm, but felt like punishment she deserved. She hoped that, through suffering, she could find forgiveness for whatever unseen sin haunted her. The hallucinations worsened over time. Sometimes she saw figures she described as demons' twisted shapes with burning eyes lurking in the corners of her vision. She would scream and cry out to her parents, terrified by what she believed were real entities surrounding her. Her mother would try to comfort her, but nothing seemed to ease the fear. Even when the apparitions disappeared, their presence lingered in Annelise's mind. She believed these beings wanted to destroy her from within, and no amount of medical treatment could stop them. Doctors urged the family to remain patient, insisting that her symptoms were caused by her epilepsy and possibly a developing mental illness. Yet the Michel family was losing hope. Every new medication seemed to come with side effects that worsened Annelise's suffering, exhaustion, mood swings, and feelings of despair. They began to suspect that what tormented their daughter went beyond science's understanding. Meanwhile, Annelise herself grew more convinced that her affliction was not a medical problem, but a spiritual one. She told her parents that the medications were useless because she was not sick in the way the doctors thought. Something evil, she believed, had taken root inside her, and only faith could drive it out. She spoke of hearing names in her mind, figures she identified as Judas, Nero, and others condemned in Christian tradition. These presences taunted her, making her believe she was trapped in a battle for her soul. By the time Annelise's condition reached its breaking point, the Michel family had exhausted every medical option available to them. Each visit to a neurologist or psychiatrist ended with a prescription for new medications, anticonvulsants, antipsychotics, but nothing relieved Annelise's torment. As weeks turned into months, her parents began to believe that something far beyond medicine was plaguing their daughter. They were devout Catholics, and it became increasingly difficult for them to ignore the possibility that Annelise's suffering was spiritual, not merely medical. Annelise, too, had abandoned hope in medical explanations. She insisted that what controlled her wasn't a disease, but a dark force. Her strange behavior and outbursts now carried a sinister weight. She claimed that malevolent beings inhabited her, whispering blasphemies and urging her to reject everything good in her life. The voices were relentless, taunting her and telling her she was destined for ruin. At times, she felt she couldn't even pray because the words became twisted in her mouth, as if the darkness within her was interfering. Her family sought the advice of local priests, hoping that the church could offer the help that doctors could not. However, the priests were cautious. Official exorcisms were rare and required proof that the afflicted person's condition could not be explained by illness alone. The priests advised the Michels to continue with medical treatment, but Annelise's worsening state left them feeling helpless. Each passing day revealed new signs of her struggle. She would refuse meals for extended periods, explaining that it was part of a personal penance, or spend hours staring at religious objects, visibly distressed as if in conflict with herself. Despite these alarming signs, most of the clergy remained hesitant. However, Father Ernst Alt, a local priest, became deeply concerned about Annelise's condition. He believed her suffering was unlike anything he had encountered before. After meeting with Annelise, he noted the strange shifts in her personality, moments where she seemed possessed by an overwhelming rage, only to collapse moments later, apologizing and sobbing uncontrollably. Father Alt, but these episodes were more than medical symptoms. He suspected that something spiritual was taking hold of her. The priest's belief was further cemented by Annelise's growing resistance to sacred items. On several occasions, she recoiled from crucifixes as if in pain and was unable to enter chapels, insisting that an unseen force was blocking her. Father Alt urged the family to pursue an exorcism, believing that it was the only way to save her. He explained that exorcisms were not quick fixes. They were difficult rituals that required time, endurance, and faith from everyone involved. But if her condition truly stemmed from a spiritual affliction, the ritual was their only option. To perform the rite, however, they needed formal permission from the diocese. Father Alt, along with another priest, Father Arnold Renz, documented Annelies's worsening symptoms and sent a request to Bishop Joseph Stangl. After reviewing the case, the bishop granted approval for the ritual Romanum, the official rite of exorcism. The priests were instructed to follow strict guidelines, ensuring the ritual was performed with care and precision. Anneliese welcomed the news of the exorcism. By this point, she was utterly convinced that she was being consumed by something evil, and she saw the ritual as her only hope for salvation. She told her parents that the demons inside her claimed they would never let her go, but she believed that through suffering, she could defeat them. Anneliese began to view her suffering not just as punishment, but as a form of sacrifice. She believed that her trials could help cleanse others, perhaps even atone for the sins of strangers she had never met. Her family was equally desperate for a solution, no matter how difficult it might be. They believed that the exorcism would be a path to healing, though none of them could have predicted the toll it would take. Annelies's condition had already pushed them to the edge emotionally, spiritually, and physically. Yet, the promise of deliverance gave them a glimmer of hope that perhaps, at long last, their daughter could be freed from the torment that had consumed her life. But with that hope came fear. They knew the ritual would be grueling, and they worried about what it would do to Annelies's fragile body. The priest warned them that the exorcism might provoke violent episodes and that there were no guarantees of success. But for the Michels, this was their final option. Medical treatments had failed, and time was slipping away. All they could do now was trust in the power of their faith and in Annelies's belief that salvation was worth any price. In the fall of 1975, the first exorcism session began inside the Michel family's modest home. The room, dimly lit by candles and filled with religious artifacts, carried the quiet heaviness of fear and hope. Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt led the ceremony, reciting prayers from the ritual Romanum, the ancient text used to expel evil spirits. The atmosphere was tense, every word of the prayer heavy with expectation. Anneliese sat in the middle of the room, her hands trembling in her lap, waiting for the first confrontation with whatever force held her captive. From the very beginning, the sessions were harrowing. As the priest prayed over her, Annelies's demeanor shifted rapidly. At times, she appeared peaceful, mouthing along with familiar prayers. But soon after, her voice would change, becoming low, hoarse, and full of malice. She would thrash violently in her chair, growling and shouting words she claimed weren't her own. It was as though multiple personalities had taken control, each one angry and defiant. She identified these voices as belonging to notorious figures like Judas and even darker beings, insisting that they lived within her and refused to leave. The exorcisms were physically and emotionally draining, not only for Anneliese, but for everyone involved. The priests and her parents often had to restrain her when she would throw herself onto the floor or bang her head against walls, driven by impulses she couldn't explain. Despite their efforts, Annelies's physical condition began to deteriorate. Her body, already fragile from the months of self-denial, grew weaker with each passing session. She was unable to keep down food, convinced by the voices that she must reject earthly nourishment to complete her mission. The priest tried to encourage her to eat, but Anneliese refused, believing that her suffering was necessary for salvation. Each exorcism session lasted for hours, sometimes stretching late into the night. Her parents were horrified by what they witnessed. Annelies's voice shifting into guttural tones that didn't sound human, her body convulsing uncontrollably, and her skin breaking out in unexplained marks and bruises. Yet there were brief moments of lucidity, when she would beg her family to continue the ritual, insisting that she could feel the darkness being forced to the surface. Her parents clung to these moments, believing that Annelies's suffering was bringing her closer to freedom. They prayed alongside the priests, sometimes holding her hands as she trembled, and whispered that she could feel herself slipping away. To them, each session, no matter how excruciating, was a step closer to reclaiming their daughter from the grip of evil. Over the course of 10 months, more than 60 exorcism sessions were performed. Annelise's condition worsened with each one. She rarely slept, her nights filled with haunting visions that left her gasping for breath. During the day, she would pace the house or sit silently, lost in her thoughts, her once bright personality reduced to a shadow of its former self. As the rituals dragged on, the demons seemed to resist with greater intensity. Annelise would scream for hours, her voice cracking from exhaustion. She would mock the priests, taunting them with obscene language, daring them to continue. The priests remained resolute, believing that the intensity of her resistance was a sign that the exorcism was working. They prayed louder, reciting the sacred words over and over, hoping to wear down whatever force held her captive. The toll on Annelise's body was undeniable. She became severely underweight, her limbs weak and trembling from exhaustion. Her knees were swollen and bruised from hours spent kneeling in prayer, her voice hoarse from constant screaming. Yet she refused to stop. She believed that her suffering was part of a larger plan, that by enduring these trials, she was helping to save others from spiritual harm. To Annelise, this was no longer just about her freedom. It was a sacrifice for a higher purpose. Despite her family's pleas for rest, Annelise insisted on continuing the exorcisms. She begged her parents not to abandon the ritual, even though they could see her body was slowly giving out. Her mother often cried during the sessions, watching helplessly as her daughter endured what seemed like unbearable pain. But Annelise would always reassure her, saying that it would all be over soon, that she would be free, even if it meant surrendering everything she had left. The priests, too, struggled with the emotional weight of the situation. Father Renz and Father Out spent countless hours in prayer, asking for strength to continue. They knew that Annelise's condition was worsening, but they believed that abandoning the ritual would be tantamount to giving in to the forces they were fighting. The line between faith and desperation blurred, and the priests pressed forward, hoping that each session would finally bring the deliverance they sought. Toward the end of the exorcisms, Annelise's moments of clarity became fewer and far between. Her speech slowed, her movements were weak and uncoordinated, and her eyes, once bright with determination, grew distant. Yet she never expressed regret for what she had endured. In her rare, lucid moments, she whispered to her parents and the priests that she was ready for the end, whatever that might mean. By June 1976, Annelise Michel's body was ravaged from months of relentless exorcisms and physical exhaustion. Her frame was skeletal, her movements slow and unsteady. Yet, despite her weakened state, she clung to a fierce belief that the torment she endured had a higher purpose. Every breath she took felt like a battle, but Annelise was certain that she was on the verge of liberation, that through suffering, she could achieve a form of spiritual victory. Her parents were filled with both hope and dread. They wanted to believe that the end was near, that their daughter would finally be free from the torment that had consumed her for years. But they also saw the toll it had taken. Annelise could no longer walk without assistance, and speaking was a struggle. Still, whenever she had moments of lucidity, she insisted that the exorcisms continue. "I have to keep going," she whispered to her mother one night, her voice barely audible. "I'm almost there." The exorcism sessions became increasingly urgent as the priests and her family sensed that they were running out of time. During one of the final rituals, Annelise's body convulsed violently, her face twisted in pain. Yet, between these intense moments, she would sometimes flash a strange, serene smile, telling those around her that she could feel the darkness weakening. It was as if she believed that each moment of agony brought her closer to a divine release. On June 30th, 1976, the final exorcism session took place. Annalise was too weak to kneel, so she lay on a mattress placed on the floor. Her parents, desperate and exhausted, held her hands, hoping against hope that this would be the moment of deliverance. Father Renz and Father Alt recited the exorcism prayers with steady determination, their voices filling the room with sacred verses. Annelise's breathing was shallow, but she forced herself to respond to the prayers, whispering yes and please stay with me whenever she had the strength. Throughout the session, Annelise's expressions alternated between anguish and moments of strange peace. At one point, she looked into her mother's eyes and murmured, "Mother, I'm afraid." Her mother stroked her hair, fighting back tears, assuring Annalise that she was not alone. They all prayed that this would be the final battle, that the forces tormenting her would release their grip at last. Toward the end of the ritual, Annalise's voice softened, and she said something that haunted those present for years to come. "Please, don't give up on me." But as the hours dragged on, her strength gave out. The session ended without the sense of triumph they had hoped for, and Annalise, too weak to speak, closed her eyes and drifted into a restless sleep. The following morning, on July 1st, 1976, Annalise Michel passed away quietly in her home. Her parents discovered her lifeless body and, in their grief, called the priests to inform them of her passing. Annelise's frail frame, reduced to just over 60 pounds, was a tragic testament to the suffering she had endured. For her family and the priests, the overwhelming question was whether her death was a spiritual victory or an unbearable loss. The tragedy did not end with Annelise's passing. In the months that followed, the case drew public attention, leading to an investigation that scrutinized the actions of her parents and the priests. Authorities questioned whether Annelise's death could have been prevented had medical intervention been prioritized over religious rituals. Her parents and the priests were charged with negligent homicide, sparking a controversial trial that captivated the nation and raised difficult questions about the intersection of faith and mental health. During the trial, Annelise's parents defended their decision, insisting that they had followed their daughter's wishes and had acted out of love and desperation. They described Annalise as a willing participant in the exorcisms, someone who truly believed that her suffering had meaning. The priests, too, stood by their actions, explaining that they had exhausted every other option and that Annalise herself had pleaded for the rituals to continue. Medical experts testified that Annalise's condition was likely the result of untreated epilepsy and psychosis, worsened by the extreme stress of the exorcisms. But for those closest to Annalise, the answer was more complicated. They believed that Annalise's suffering could not be fully explained by medical terms, that something deeper had taken place, something beyond human understanding. In the end, the priests and Annalise's parents were found guilty of negligent homicide, but received suspended sentences, as the court acknowledged that they had acted out of a misguided sense of care and faith. The verdict left many unresolved questions. Was Annalise a victim of untreated illness, or did she truly endure a spiritual trial? And if her suffering was real, did it accomplish the redemption she had hoped for? Annalise's story remains both a cautionary tale and a source of reflection on the complexities of faith, mental health, and the human need for meaning. To this day, some view her as a tragic figure who was failed by the systems meant to help her, while others believe that she experienced a spiritual battle that few can understand. In the years following her death, her grave became a place of pilgrimage for those who believed in the possibility of miracles. Visitors left flowers, prayers, and messages, hoping that, in some way, Annelise's suffering had opened a path to healing. But for her family and the priests who had stood by her, the story was one of profound loss, a reminder that sometimes the search for salvation can lead to unimaginable sacrifice. In the late 1930s, As the world teetered on the brink of war, the quiet English countryside in Suffolk held secrets long buried beneath the earth. The land, rolling in green, had a gentle way of keeping its past concealed. But for Edith Pretty, the owner of Sutton Hoo Estate, the ancient burial mounds on her property stirred her curiosity. Edith was a wealthy widow in her 50s, and despite her age, she possessed an adventurous spirit. She had always been fascinated by history and archaeology. After years of living on the estate and gazing at the mounds, she began to wonder what lay beneath them. Her interest grew after hearing local legends that these mounds might hide long-lost treasures, perhaps even the resting place of kings. It was the summer of 1938 when Edith finally decided to act. She had been reading articles on recent archaeological digs and, inspired, she contacted the local Ipswich Museum for advice. They recommended Basil Brown, a self-taught archaeologist with a passion for unearthing history. Though not formally trained, Brown had a deep knowledge of the land and a reputation for careful, thorough work. Edith invited him to the estate, and soon an agreement was made to begin exploring the mysterious mounds. Basil Brown was not a man of wealth or high education, but he possessed a talent that few others did. A sense of the land. He had an ability to read the earth and understand its secrets. When he first set foot on Sutton Hoo, he was struck by the sheer size of the mounds. Some were as tall as trees, looming over the landscape like sentinels guarding something precious. The excavation began in earnest, but no one could have imagined what they were about to uncover. The first few days were slow. Basil and his small team of laborers worked carefully, mindful not to damage anything. They had no idea what lay beneath, whether it would be an empty mound or something extraordinary. At first, the dig revealed little more than small fragments of iron and decayed wood, signs that the mound had been disturbed before. Yet Basil remained optimistic. He knew that patience was key. As the team continued to remove layers of earth, something remarkable began to take shape, the outline of a ship. Brown could hardly believe his eyes. The sandy soil had preserved an impression of a ship, large enough to befit royalty. The wood had long since decayed, leaving only a ghostly imprint, but the form of the ship was unmistakable. It stretched nearly 90 feet long, a size that suggested this was no ordinary burial. This was something far grander. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Edith Pretty herself came to the site daily, watching with excitement as the ancient vessel emerged from the soil. She had hoped for something significant, but the magnitude of what was being uncovered exceeded her wildest dreams. The ship's structure, though fragile and partially destroyed by time, was evidence of a culture that had mastery over the sea. But it wasn't just the size of the ship that astonished the team. As they dug deeper, they realized that the vessel had been used as a burial ship, likely for someone of great importance. The thought lingered. Could this be the resting place of a long-forgotten king? Excitement turned to trepidation as the team carefully uncovered more of the ship. The scale of the task ahead became clearer. This was not a simple dig. It was a mission to recover a piece of history so old that its very existence had been forgotten. Every move had to be precise, every piece of earth removed with care. Basil Brown knew the significance of what they had found, but he also understood the risks. An excavation of this scale had never been attempted before in England, at least not with such a delicate site. The ship was a marvel, but it was fragile. Any mistake could destroy what little remained. As more of the ship was revealed, it became clear that this was not an isolated find. The ship was part of a much larger burial complex, perhaps one used by an elite group of people warriors, leaders, and rulers. The ship had been placed in the earth with great care, loaded with treasures meant to accompany its occupant into the afterlife. By the end of the summer, the excavation had gained attention beyond Suffolk. Archaeologists from across Britain began to take notice. The press, too, caught wind of the discovery. Headlines soon spoke of Britain's greatest find, and speculation ran wild about the identity of the person buried within the ship. Some believed it could be a legendary king or warrior, a figure whose story had been lost to time. Despite the growing attention, Edith Pretty remained modest about her role in the discovery. She had simply acted on a hunch, following her curiosity. But as the ship continued to reveal its secrets, it became clear that her decision to explore the mounds was one that would reshape the understanding of England's ancient history. The discovery of the ship set the stage for a much larger adventure, one that would continue to unfold in the months and years to come. For now, though, the ship lay beneath the soil, waiting for its full story to be told. As the sun rose over the fields of Suffolk in the summer of 1939, a small team of workers arrived at Suttonhoo, eager to continue their excavation of what was shaping up to be one of the most remarkable finds in British history. Basil Brown, the archaeologist leading the dig, had uncovered the outline of an ancient ship. But what lay beneath was still a mystery. The real work was only just beginning. The excavation site, now buzzing with activity, was far from a glamorous operation. With no heavy machinery and only simple tools like shovels, trowels, and brushes, the work was slow, meticulous, and physically demanding. Each layer of soil had to be removed carefully to avoid disturbing any fragile artifacts that might lie beneath the surface. Time was not on their side, as the threat of war loomed over Europe, adding urgency to their efforts. A small team of workers, mostly local laborers, had little formal training in archaeology, but they followed his instructions diligently. He had a deep respect for the past, and he knew that any mistake, no matter how small, could erase vital clues to understanding the burial. The ship they had uncovered was not made of iron or stone. It had once been a grand wooden vessel. Over the centuries, the wood had decayed, leaving only the impression of the ship in the soil. This meant that the entire outline of the ship was incredibly delicate, requiring precision to uncover it without causing damage. As they dug deeper, the true size of the ship became more apparent. Nearly 90 feet long, it was the kind of ship that could only have belonged to someone of great importance. It wasn't just its size that amazed the team. It was the craftsmanship. The lines of the ship's hull were graceful, curving elegantly through the earth, a testament to the shipbuilders who had constructed it more than 1,000 years earlier. Brown's excitement grew as the excavation progressed, but so did his sense of responsibility. The discovery of the ship was already monumental, but he knew there had to be more. Anglo-Saxon burial customs suggested that whoever was buried here had been laid to rest with treasures fit for a king. The ship, it seemed, was just the beginning. As the days passed, the team began to uncover a wealth of small finds, pieces of iron, fragments of pottery, and even a few rusted nails that hinted at the ship's construction. These items were important, but they were not the treasures the team had hoped to find. Still, Basil remained patient. He knew that the most valuable artifacts were likely still hidden deeper within the burial chamber, and he was determined to reach them. The dig became more challenging as they approached the center of the ship, where the burial chamber was believed to be. The earth here was heavier, and the signs of earlier disturbances, likely grave robbers from centuries past, became more evident. Some parts of the ship had been damaged, either by the passage of time or by human hands, but there were still large sections of the vessel that remained untouched. One day, as the team carefully removed soil from the center of the ship, they uncovered something extraordinary, a large wooden structure that had once formed the burial chamber. Though the wood itself had long since decayed, the impression it left behind was unmistakable. The chamber was large enough to hold not only a body, but also the treasures that would have accompanied it. Basil Brown was struck by the enormity of what they had found. This wasn't just a ship burial, it was a royal tomb. The chamber was situated in the very heart of the ship, a place of honor reserved for someone of the highest status. Though the chamber had been damaged over the centuries, there were still signs that it had once held magnificent items. The team worked slowly, methodically, removing the earth surrounding the chamber. As they did, they began to find objects that hinted at the grandeur of the burial. The first signs were small metal fragments, delicate pieces of jewelry, and the remnants of finely crafted items that had once adorned the body. These objects, though decayed, were exquisite in their design, suggesting that the person buried here had been incredibly wealthy, perhaps even a king. But the true treasures of the burial had not yet been uncovered. Brown knew that the most significant finds were still hidden beneath layers of soil. The team worked tirelessly, day after day, uncovering more and more of the burial chamber. The anticipation was palpable. Every piece of earth they removed brought them closer to the moment of revelation. As the excavation continued, word of the discovery spread even further. Archaeologists from across the country began to take notice, and some even traveled to Sutton Hoo to witness the dig for themselves. It was becoming clear that this was no ordinary excavation. What they had uncovered was one of the greatest archaeological finds in British history, and it was only a matter of time before the world would know the full extent of the discovery. Despite the growing attention, Basil Brown remained focused on the task at hand. The pressure was immense, but he knew that they were on the verge of something incredible. The burial chamber was nearly fully exposed, and soon they would uncover the treasures that had been hidden for centuries. As the final layers of earth were removed from the chamber, the team began to realize just how grand the burial truly was. They found evidence of finely wrought metalwork, including gold and silver items that had once adorned the person buried within. Though many of the treasures had been damaged or lost to time, what remained was enough to suggest that this was the burial of someone truly significant. The discovery of the burial chamber was a turning point in the excavation. What had begun as a simple curiosity had become a full-scale archaeological dig, one that would change the understanding of early medieval England. For Basil Brown and his team, the discovery of the ship and the chamber was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would unfold in the months and years to come. The discovery of the burial chamber at Sutton Hoo marked the turning point in the excavation. The ship had been a stunning find, but the treasures hidden within the chamber were what truly revealed the significance of this ancient burial. As Basil Brown and his team carefully removed the last layers of soil, they began to uncover a collection of artifacts that hinted at the immense wealth and status of the person entombed within. The burial chamber, located at the heart of the ship, had likely once contained a wooden coffin, though all traces of the wood had long since decayed. What remained, however, was a dazzling array of items that had been placed alongside the body items that spoke of a life of power, influence, and high social standing. This was no ordinary grave. This was the final resting place of someone of immense importance, perhaps even a king. One of the first objects to emerge from the soil was a magnificent helmet. Though damaged by time and the elements, it was clear that this was no simple piece of armor. The helmet was adorned with intricate designs, including representations of fierce animals and warriors, all crafted in exquisite detail. It had once been worn by a figure of great significance, someone who likely commanded both respect and fear. The helmet, with its mask-like faceplate and iron cheek pieces, gave the impression of a powerful warrior king. Its craftsmanship suggested that the person buried here had connections to distant lands, perhaps Scandinavia, where similar helmets had been found. As the team continued to excavate, they uncovered more treasures. A finely wrought sword was found next, its hilt inlaid with gold and garnets. The sword was a symbol of power, not just a weapon, but a representation of the authority of the one who had wielded it. Alongside the sword were other items associated with warfare, including a large shield and a collection of spears. These were the tools of a leader, someone who had commanded armies and fought in battles. The items painted a picture of a man who had been both a ruler and a warrior, a figure whose life had been shaped by conflict and conquest. Yet the burial chamber also contained objects of great beauty, items that suggested the person buried here had enjoyed a life of luxury and refinement. Gold buckles, intricately crafted jewelry, and a collection of silverware were found, each piece more ornate than the last. Some of the items had been imported from far-off lands, including silver bowls and spoons from the Byzantine Empire, evidence of trade and cultural connections that spanned continents. These items showed that the person buried here had lived in a time when England was not an isolated island, but part of a wider world, a world connected by trade routes and diplomacy. Perhaps the most striking find was a large, elaborately decorated belt buckle made of solid gold. Weighing over a pound, the buckle was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, featuring interwoven patterns that symbolized strength and unity. Its size and weight suggested that it had been worn by someone of great stature, both physically and socially. The buckle, along with the other treasures, spoke of immense wealth, the kind of wealth that only the most powerful in society could accumulate. As the team cataloged the items found in the burial chamber, it became increasingly clear that this was not just a burial, it was a statement. The person buried here had wanted to be remembered, to leave a lasting legacy. The ship, the treasures, and the sheer scale of the burial all suggested that this had been a leader of extraordinary influence, someone who had shaped the course of history in their time. But who was this person? That question lingered over the excavation like a shadow. No body had been found in the burial chamber. Centuries of decay had left little more than traces of organic matter where the body once lay. Still, archaeologists were able to piece together clues from the artifacts and the burial itself. The size of the ship and the opulence of the treasures suggested that this was the grave of an Anglo-Saxon king, perhaps even Redwald, the ruler of East Anglia in the early 7th century. Redwald was a powerful figure in Anglo-Saxon England. According to historical records, he had been a strong leader who wielded significant influence over other kings in the region. He had converted to Christianity, but also maintained traditional pagan beliefs, a fact reflected in the mix of Christian and pagan symbols found in the burial chamber. If this was indeed the grave of Redwald, it would confirm his status as one of the most important figures of the Anglo-Saxon period. The burial also revealed much about the society in which this leader had lived. The treasures found in the chamber were not just symbols of personal wealth. They were representations of the interconnectedness of early medieval Europe. The silver from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian designs all pointed to a world in which goods, ideas, and cultures flowed across borders. But while the items found in the burial chamber were awe-inspiring, they also raised questions. What had caused this king to be buried in such a grand manner? Had his death been the result of natural causes, or had he fallen in battle? Had this burial been a display of his people's devotion, or was it meant to send a message to those who came after him? The ship, laden with treasures, seemed to speak of a desire to carry these symbols of power into the afterlife, a belief that even in death, this leader would continue to hold sway over the world. As the excavation came to an end, the team knew they had uncovered something truly extraordinary. The burial chamber at Sutton had revealed treasures that had been hidden for more than 1,000 years. Treasures that told the story of a long-forgotten king and the world in which he had lived. For Basil Brown and his team, it was the culmination of months of hard work and dedication. But for the wider world, it was just the beginning of a new understanding of England's past. The treasures of Sutton would soon be displayed in museums, where people from all over the world could come and marvel at the craftsmanship and beauty of these ancient artifacts. Yet, even as they were cleaned and preserved, they would remain tied to the mystery of the person who had been buried in that ship, a figure whose identity might never be known for certain, but whose legacy would live on through the objects he left behind. The burial chamber had been unearthed, but its secrets would continue to captivate the imaginations of historians, archaeologists, and the public for generations to come. The excavation at Sutton Hoo had revealed extraordinary treasures, but it was the discovery's ripple effect that truly began to reshape the understanding of England's ancient past. As word of the find spread across Britain, the magnitude of what had been uncovered became clear, not just to archaeologists, but to the general public, scholars, and even political figures. The Sutton Hoo ship burial was quickly recognized as one of the most important archaeological finds in British history, a window into a time that had long been shrouded in mystery. In the summer of 1939, just as the treasures from Sutton Hoo were being carefully excavated, the world was on the brink of conflict. The tensions leading to the outbreak of World War II were mounting, and in many ways, the discovery at Sutton Hoo served as a reminder of Britain's deep history and resilience. As the nation prepared for the uncertainties of war, the treasures from this ancient burial offered a sense of pride and continuity, connecting modern Britons to their Anglo-Saxon ancestors. For Edith Pretty, the landowner whose curiosity had sparked the excavation, the discovery had an emotional impact. She had long suspected that the mounds on her estate hid something special, but even she couldn't have imagined the grandeur of what lay beneath. Edith, a reserved and thoughtful woman, had always been interested in history and archaeology, but the scale of the find at Sutton Hoo exceeded her wildest expectations. She visited the excavation site daily, quietly observing as Basil Brown and his team painstakingly unearthed each artifact. Though Edith had initiated the dig, she remained humble about her role, insisting that the discovery belonged to history. In the months following the excavation, Edith made a decision that would forever cement her place in the story of Sutton Hoo. Rather than keeping the treasures for herself or selling them, she donated the entire collection to the British Museum. It was an act of generosity that reflected her deep sense of responsibility to history and her desire for the treasures to be studied and preserved for future generations. The decision ensured that the artifacts would be accessible to the public and to scholars, who would spend decades analyzing the find and its implications. The British Museum, which had long been a repository for the world's greatest cultural artifacts, was quick to recognize the importance of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The items, including the famous helmet, the gold belt buckle, and the intricately crafted jewelry, were displayed prominently, attracting visitors from across the country and beyond. People flocked to see the artifacts, eager to catch a glimpse of the ancient past and to learn more about the mysterious figure who had been buried in such splendor. The public reaction to the Sutton Hoo discovery was overwhelming. Newspapers ran headlines about the buried treasure and the king in the ship, fueling speculation about the identity of the person entombed in the ship burial. Theories abounded, with some suggesting that the ship had belonged to a legendary warrior, while others believed it was the resting place of a great king. The fascination with the find extended beyond the borders of Britain, with international scholars and archaeologists expressing interest in studying the artifacts and the burial site. But while the treasures themselves were stunning, it was the broader implications of the discovery that truly excited the academic community. Before Sutton Hoo, the early medieval period in England, often referred to as the Dark Ages, was seen as a time of cultural stagnation, a period following the fall of the Roman Empire, when much of Europe was thought to have fallen into disarray. The Sutton Hoo find challenged this view, offering evidence of a sophisticated and cosmopolitan society that had existed in England in the 6th and 7th centuries. The discovery of objects from distant lands, including silverware from Byzantium and garnets from as far away as India, demonstrated that the Anglo-Saxon elite were part of a vast network of trade and cultural exchange. These connections extended across Europe and beyond, suggesting that early medieval England was far more interconnected with the wider world than previously thought. The items found in the burial chamber revealed a society that valued craftsmanship, artistry, and wealth, a far cry from the image of a dark and isolated age. For historians and archaeologists, the Sutton Hoo ship burial opened up new lines of inquiry. Who was the person buried in the ship, and what did his burial tell us about the society he lived in? The consensus began to form around the idea that the burial belonged to Redwold, the King of East Anglia, a powerful figure who had been instrumental in the politics of early medieval England. While no definitive proof existed to confirm Redwold's identity as the person buried in the ship, the evidence, both historical and archaeological, pointed strongly in that direction. As the academic community delved deeper into the meaning of the Sutton Hoo treasures, the site itself became a point of national pride. The discovery was seen as a testament to Britain's deep and rich history, a reminder that the country's roots extended far back into the early medieval period. This sense of pride was particularly potent in the context of the looming war. As Britain prepared for the possibility of conflict, the Sutton Hoo find served as a symbol of resilience and continuity, a reminder that the nation had weathered countless challenges throughout its long history. However, the outbreak of World War II in September 1939 brought new challenges to the preservation of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The artifacts, now housed in the British Museum, were packed away and moved to secure storage to protect them from potential bombing raids. It would be several years before they could be displayed again, but even in storage, the significance of the find continued to grow. In the years following the war, the treasures of Sutton Hoo were once again placed on display, drawing renewed interest from scholars and the public alike. The site itself became a place of pilgrimage for those interested in England's early medieval past. Archaeological work at Sutton Hoo continued, with new discoveries shedding further light on the burial and the culture that had created it. As time passed, the Sutton Hoo ship burial became more than just an archaeological discovery. It became a symbol of Britain's cultural heritage. The treasures found in the burial chamber were celebrated not just for their beauty, but for what they represented, a connection to the distant past, to a time when kings ruled the land and the seas, and when the Anglo-Saxon people laid the foundations for the England that would emerge in the centuries to come. The impact of Sutton Hoo extended beyond the academic world. It influenced popular culture, inspiring books, films, and even artwork. The treasures, with their intricate designs and mysterious origins, captured the imagination of people around the world. The Sutton Hoo helmet, in particular, became an iconic symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, its distinctive design appearing in countless representations of early medieval warriors. But more than anything, Sutton Hoo stood as a testament to the power of curiosity and perseverance. What had begun as a simple desire to explore a set of burial mounds on a quiet Suffolk estate had led to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. The impact of that discovery would be felt for generations, reminding the world of the enduring legacy of the Anglo-Saxon people and the mysteries that still lay buried beneath the earth. The Sutton Hoo discovery forever altered the understanding of early medieval England. Long after the final artifact had been unearthed and the excavation had concluded, the mysteries of the ship burial continued to captivate historians, archaeologists, and the general public. The artifacts, now safely housed in the British Museum, were more than just relics. They were keys to unlocking a forgotten past, one that had been shrouded in mystery for centuries. As scholars continued to study the treasures, new insights into the life and times of the Anglo-Saxons emerged. The burial itself became a symbol of the sophisticated society that had existed in England during the early 7th century, a society far more complex and interconnected than previously believed. Sutton Hoo had given the world a glimpse into the life of a ruler who had commanded immense respect and wielded significant power, whether it was Redwold, as many believed, or another figure of equal prominence. Despite all that had been uncovered, questions still lingered. Chief among them was the identity of the person buried in the ship. While the evidence pointed strongly to Redwold, the lack of definitive proof left room for debate. Some scholars suggested alternative possibilities, including other kings or powerful nobles from the East Anglian kingdom. The absence of human remains, likely lost to the ravages of time and the acidic soil, meant that the mystery of the burial's occupant might never be fully resolved. Even without a clear identity, the significance of the burial was undeniable. The ship, the treasures, and the careful arrangement of the grave goods all pointed to someone of immense importance. This was a person whose life had been marked by power, prestige, and wealth, someone who had commanded loyalty and respect from those around them. The grandeur of the burial reflected the importance placed on status and honor in Anglo-Saxon society, where kings and nobles were celebrated both in life and in death. The mystery extended beyond the identity of the buried figure. The purpose of the ship burial itself raised questions. Why had such an elaborate ceremony been conducted, and what did it symbolize? Ship burials were rare in England, and the practice was more commonly associated with Scandinavian cultures. Some historians believe that the Sutton Hoo burial was a reflection of the complex cultural influences at play in early medieval England. The Anglo-Saxons, who had come to Britain as invaders, had absorbed elements of both Romang and Scandinavian traditions, creating a unique blend of customs and beliefs. The ship burial, with its mixture of Christian and pagan symbols, suggested that the person buried at Sutton Hoo had navigated a world in which old and new beliefs coexisted. Redwold, if he was indeed the person buried there, had been known for his dual faith embracing Christianity while still honoring traditional pagan practices. The burial reflected this tension, with the treasures revealing a world in which religious beliefs were evolving, but not yet settled. The items found in the burial chamber also offered clues about the broader world in which this person had lived. The silverware from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian and Frankish designs all pointed to a world connected by trade and diplomacy. The Sutton Hoo burial was not just a testament to one person's power. It was a reflection of a global network of exchange, where goods and ideas flowed across borders. As the years passed, Sutton Hoo became a touchstone for those studying the early medieval period. Archaeologists continued to explore the site, conducting further excavations and uncovering additional evidence of the Anglo-Saxon people who had once inhabited the area. While no discoveries rivaled the grandeur of the original ship burial, each new find added to the growing picture of life in East Anglia during the early 7th century. The site itself was transformed into a place of historical importance. Sutton Hoo, once a quiet estate with little public attention, became a destination for visitors from around the world. People came to walk among the burial mounds, to imagine the grand ship that had once rested beneath the earth, and to learn about the Anglo-Saxon kings who had shaped England's early history. The National Trust, which took over the management of the site, worked to preserve the landscape and educate the public about the significance of the discovery. The Sutton Hoo ship burial also left a lasting mark on popular culture. The story of the excavation and the treasures it uncovered inspired books, documentaries, and films, all seeking to capture the drama and mystery of the find. The iconic image of the Sutton Hoo helmet, with its menacing faceplate and intricate designs, became a symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, appearing in countless depictions of early medieval warriors. The discovery continued to spark the imaginations of writers, artists, and filmmakers who were drawn to the idea of a long-lost king buried with his treasures, waiting to be rediscovered. Yet for all the attention Sutton Hoo received, the site remained, at its core, a place of deep historical and emotional significance. The ship burial was a reminder of the fragility of history, of how easily the past can be forgotten, buried beneath layers of earth, and how it can be uncovered only through persistence and curiosity. Basil Brown, the self-taught archaeologist who had first unearthed the ship, had never imagined the scope of what he would find. His dedication and careful work had revealed a treasure trove of history that might otherwise have remained hidden. In the decades following the excavation, Brown's role in the discovery was finally recognized. Though initially overshadowed by professional archaeologists who had later joined the dig, Brown's contributions were celebrated as those of a skilled and dedicated archaeologist. His careful methods and deep respect for the site had ensured that the treasures of Sutton Hoo were preserved for future generations. Today, he is remembered as the man who brought one of England's greatest archaeological discoveries to light. As the 21st century began, Sutton Hoo continued to capture the public's imagination. New technologies allowed archaeologists to explore the site in ways that had once been impossible, using ground-penetrating radar and other tools to search for hidden features beneath the earth. These advancements, while yielding fascinating insights, also underscored how much of the past still lay waiting to be discovered. The ship burial at Sutton Hoo was just one chapter in a much larger story, one that archaeologists and historians were still piecing together. For all the answers Sutton Hoo had provided, the site remained a place of wonder and speculation. Who had been buried there, and what had their life been like? What had driven their people to create such a magnificent burial? And what did it say about their beliefs, their values, and their place in the world? These questions, and many others, would likely remain unanswered, but that was part of the magic of Sutton Hoo. It was a place where history and mystery intertwined, where the past reached out to the present in ways both profound and elusive. The ship and its treasures had been buried for more than 1,000 years, hidden from the world, waiting for the right moment to be found. And now, as the story of Sutton Hoo continued to unfold, it was clear that the discovery had not only changed the way people understood the past, it had become part of the fabric of Britain's national identity, a reminder of the deep roots that connected the present to the distant, mysterious past. The year was 1974, and the Smurl family was eager to begin a new chapter in their lives. Jack and Janet Smurl, along with their young daughters, Dawn and Heather, were moving into a quiet neighborhood in West Pittston, Pennsylvania. They were an ordinary family, working class, looking forward to creating a peaceful life together. Their new home, a duplex, was modest but felt like a fresh start. It was the kind of house where Jack could imagine their kids growing up, safe and sound. Little did they know that it would become the setting for a nightmare that would challenge their understanding of reality. The move itself had gone smoothly enough. Jack had just received a promotion at work, and while the extra responsibilities weighed on him, it also meant more financial security for his growing family. Janet, ever the optimist, had already begun mentally decorating their new home. She saw potential in every corner, every wall, every floorboard. Despite its age and the need for some repairs, she felt hopeful. After all, it was a house they could truly make their own. But from the very beginning, the house felt different. At first, it was nothing overtly alarming, just an uneasy feeling that neither Jack nor Janet could quite shake. The air inside the house always seemed cooler than it should have been, especially in the upstairs rooms. There was a certain heaviness in some areas, like the air was denser, harder to breathe. Janet would sometimes feel as though she was being watched, but when she turned around, there was no one there. Then came the sounds. It started with light scratching noises in the walls. Jack, a practical man, assumed it was mice and set about putting down traps, but nothing ever turned up. The scratching persisted. At night, the family would hear soft whispers, faint but unnerving. Sometimes the voices seemed to come from the attic, but when Jack went to check, he found nothing but old insulation and dust. There were no drafts, no wind that could be causing the sounds, and yet the whispers continued. At this point, the family tried to rationalize what was happening. The house was old, so it made sense that there would be creaks and groans. They were still settling in after all. Janet, ever the voice of reason, would reassure herself and the girls that the house was just getting used to them. But deep down, a seed of unease had already been planted. Weeks passed, and the odd occurrences began to escalate. Janet was in the kitchen one afternoon, preparing lunch, when she noticed a dark stain forming on the ceiling above. Her heart sank. Plumbing issues were the last thing they needed. But when Jack came to inspect it, he found that the pipes were fine. The stain, which looked like a deep red blotch, couldn't be explained. Even more disturbingly, it seemed to vanish later that evening, as though it had never been there at all. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, a light bulb exploded in the living room. Glass showered the floor, and the family jumped back in shock. Jack cursed under his breath, muttering something about faulty wiring, but when he replaced the bulb, everything seemed normal again. The next day, though, another bulb blew out in the hallway. This time, Janet noticed that the air had grown cold moments before the explosion, sending a chill down her spine. As the incidents piled up, it became increasingly difficult to dismiss them as mere coincidences. Jack, ever the rational thinker, tried to maintain control of the situation. He busied himself with work, throwing himself into his job to avoid acknowledging the strangeness at home. Janet, on the other hand, began to feel the strain more acutely. She spent more time in the house than anyone else, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on her more and more each day. One particularly unsettling night, as Janet lay in bed beside a sleeping Jack, she heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing outside their bedroom door. Thinking it was one of the girls, she got up to check. But when she opened the door, the hallway was empty. Her daughters were fast asleep in their rooms, and yet the sound of footsteps continued, echoing faintly as though coming from just out of reach. Fear gripped Janet, but she refused to let it consume her. She told herself it was her imagination, maybe just the house settling. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. She could feel it in her bones. The house wasn't just old. It was something else entirely. And whatever was there, it wasn't friendly. The children, too, began to notice strange things. Dawn, the eldest, mentioned seeing shadows moving in her room at night, though there were no trees or passing cars that could account for them. Heather, still too young to fully understand, complained of bad dreams. She would often wake up crying, saying there was someone in her room watching her. Janet did her best to comfort her daughters, but inside, her anxiety was growing. Jack, still unwilling to fully accept what was happening, brushed off their concerns. He chalked it up to stress from the move, but as the days turned into weeks, even he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. He would come home from work and find the lights flickering, or a door that had been firmly shut would now be wide open. Still, he insisted that they could handle it, that it was all in their heads. But one night, something happened that shattered Jack's skepticism. As he and Janet were watching television in the living room, a foul, rotten stench filled the air. It was so overpowering that it made them gag. Jack leaped up, convinced there was a dead animal trapped somewhere in the house. But after searching every inch of the room, he found nothing. The smell lingered for hours, then disappeared just as suddenly as it had arrived. From that moment on, Jack could no longer deny that something was terribly, horribly wrong with their new home. The once warm promise of a fresh start had been overshadowed by a creeping darkness, something neither of them could explain but both could feel. The house, which had once represented hope and security, was now a source of fear and uncertainty. And as the days passed, the Smurls began to realize that whatever was happening wasn't going to stop. It was only just beginning. As the chapter closes, the family's unease is palpable. They are trapped between denial and dread, unwilling to admit what they all now suspect. They were not alone in that house. Something unseen and malevolent had taken root, and it was growing stronger with each passing day. This would be the beginning of their long, harrowing battle against an evil they could neither see nor understand. As the weeks turned into months, the small family's sense of unease morphed into outright fear. What had begun as strange sounds and fleeting shadows became impossible to ignore. The malevolent presence in their home was growing stronger, and with it, the intensity of the disturbances. The first sign that things had taken a darker turn came one afternoon when Janet was alone in the house. She had just put Heather down for a nap and was folding laundry in the bedroom when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Her heart quickened. Jack wasn't due home from work for hours, and the children were asleep. She tried to stay calm, convincing herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more deliberate, as though someone or something was pacing just outside her door. With shaky hands, Janet crept to the hallway, half expecting to see one of the girls out of bed. But the hallway was empty, and the air was thick with that now familiar chill. She stood there, frozen, as the footsteps seemed to move through the house. They thudded across the ceiling, down the stairs, and into the kitchen. Janet's breath caught in her throat. There was no explanation for it. It felt as though an invisible intruder was making its way through their home, indifferent to her presence, but undeniably there. When Jack came home later that evening, Janet recounted the events, her voice trembling with fear. But Jack, still clinging to the hope that all of this had a rational explanation, downplayed her concerns. "Old houses make noise," he said, though he knew in his heart that this was no ordinary creak or groan of aging wood. That night, the family was jolted awake by a series of violent bangs. It sounded like someone was slamming doors all throughout the house. Jack leaped out of bed, rushing down the hallway to check on the girls. They were huddled together in Dawn's room, their eyes wide with terror. Dawn insisted that she had seen a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed just moments before the noises began. This time, Jack didn't have an answer. He checked the windows and doors, ensuring they were all locked, but nothing was out of place. The banging had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Janet stood in the hallway, clutching her robe tightly around her, feeling utterly helpless. Whatever was in their home was no longer content with being subtle. It was making its presence known. As the days passed, the activity in the house grew more physical. Objects began to move on their own. It started small. Janet would find the kitchen chairs out of place or the TV remote on the opposite side of the room. But soon, larger items were being tossed around as though by an invisible force. One afternoon, as Janet was preparing dinner, a heavy cabinet door swung open and slammed shut with such force that it cracked the wood. The noise startled her so badly that she dropped the knife she was holding, cutting her hand in the process. Blood dripped onto the countertop as she stood there, frozen in shock. The children, too, were affected. Dawn and Heather would often wake up in the middle of the night, screaming, insisting they had seen people in their rooms. Dawn spoke of a shadowy figure that seemed to follow her around the house, always just out of sight, but unmistakably there. Heather, barely old enough to understand, became withdrawn, refusing to sleep in her room unless someone was with her. Even during the day, the girls were on edge, jumping at the slightest sound or movement. Jack tried to maintain a sense of control, but the strain was beginning to show. He started staying at work later, desperate to avoid the suffocating atmosphere of their home. But even at the office, he couldn't escape the feeling that something dark had latched onto his family. His co-workers noticed the change in him. His once easygoing demeanor had been replaced by exhaustion and irritability. It wasn't just the physical disturbances that weighed on them. The emotional toll of living in constant fear was taking its toll. Jack and Janet, who had once been a loving and supportive couple, now found themselves snapping at each other over the smallest things. Tension hung thick in the air, not just from the entity that haunted them, but from the cracks it was creating in their marriage. One night, as Jack sat in the living room trying to distract himself with the evening news, the smell returned, the same foul, rotting stench that had overwhelmed them before. It seeped into the room so suddenly and so intensely that he gagged. He rushed to open a window, but the smell clung to him, making the room feel even more suffocating. Janet, who had been upstairs putting the girls to bed, came downstairs with a look of horror on her face. "It's in their room, Jack," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I can feel it. It's watching them." Jack didn't want to believe it, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. In the days that followed, things only got worse. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, a deep growling sound filled the air, seeming to come from the walls themselves. Jack and Janet froze, the girls crying in terror as the sound grew louder, more menacing. It felt as though the house itself was alive, a malevolent force surrounding them, closing in. For the first time, Jack found himself admitting the unthinkable. There was something in their house, something beyond their understanding. The fear that had been gnawing at him for months was now fully realized. They were not imagining things, and this wasn't some harmless poltergeist. This was something darker, more dangerous. Despite his reluctance, Jack agreed to seek outside help. The tension in their home had become unbearable, and the safety of their children was now at stake. Janet had been begging him for weeks to call anyone who could help. She had heard of people who specialized in these kinds of situations, people who had experience dealing with the supernatural. Though Jack still felt a flicker of doubt, he knew they could no longer handle this alone. The day after the growling incident, Jack reached out to a local priest. He was skeptical at first, but willing to listen to their story. The priest agreed to visit their home, offering to perform a blessing in the hopes of dispelling whatever evil was lurking there. But when he arrived, the house seemed to fight back. The air grew thick and heavy, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The priest, visibly shaken, said prayers and sprinkled holy water throughout the rooms, but it did little to calm the atmosphere. That night, the disturbances grew even worse. As the family huddled together in the living room, the lights flickered wildly, plunging them into darkness. A loud crash came from the kitchen, as though all the dishes had been hurled to the floor. Jack ran to investigate, but found nothing out of place. The house was playing with them, tormenting them in ways that defied logic and reason. Janet could no longer hide the deep sense of dread she felt every waking moment. She had always believed in the goodness of the world, but now, faced with the unrelenting terror in their own home, she was starting to lose hope. The entity seemed to feed on their fear, growing stronger with every passing day. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a slow, deliberate attack on their sanity, their faith, and their family. By the end of the chapter, the Smurls are on the verge of breaking. Jack's skepticism has been shattered, and Janet's resolve is weakening. The paranormal disturbances are no longer random. They are targeted, deliberate, and malicious. The family is trapped in a nightmare they can't escape, and as they stand on the precipice of despair, they know one thing for certain. Whatever is in their house has no intention of leaving. By now, the Smurl family had reached a breaking point. The eerie occurrences that once felt like unsettling background noise to their lives had transformed into a full-fledged assault on their sanity and safety. They could no longer deny what was happening inside their home. Something dark, malicious, and far beyond their control had taken root. With no other options left, Jack and Janet made the difficult decision to seek outside help. They needed answers, and more importantly, they needed a way to reclaim their lives. Janet had heard whispers about a couple who specialized in cases like theirs Ed and Lorraine Warren, well-known paranormal investigators with years of experience. The Warrens had built their reputation by helping families who were dealing with the unexplainable. They weren't just ghost hunters. They were demonologists who had encountered entities far worse than a typical haunting. It was a last-ditch effort, but the Smurls were desperate. They hoped that the Warrens could offer some sort of explanation, or better yet, a solution. The first meeting with Ed and Lorraine Warren was one of cautious hope. The couple arrived at the small residence in the late afternoon, their faces solemn yet kind. They had seen this kind of fear before, the kind that eats away at people's peace of mind, leaving them fragile and unsure. Lorraine, a clairvoyant, could feel the heaviness in the air before she even stepped through the door. She looked at Janet with a mixture of sympathy and concern, knowing full well what might lie ahead. Inside, the house was as cold and unwelcoming as ever. Ed wasted no time in setting up his equipment, audio recorders, infrared cameras, and temperature gauges. He wanted to document every possible sign of the paranormal. Lorraine, on the other hand, walked slowly through the rooms, her eyes half closed as she reached out with her mind, trying to connect with whatever presence lingered there. Her expression darkened as she moved from room to room. "There's something here," Lorraine whispered to Janet as they stood in the hallway, her voice barely audible. "It's not just one spirit. I can feel multiple presences, angry, confused, and something much darker. Much worse." Janet's stomach twisted in knots. She had known, deep down, that it wasn't just her imagination. But hearing it confirmed by someone like Lorraine Warren made it all the more terrifying. Ed approached, his brow furrowed. "We're dealing with more than just a haunting here," he said. "There's a demonic entity in this house, possibly more than one. It's feeding off the fear, off the tension in the family." The words sent a chill down Janet's spine. Demonic. She had feared as much, but hearing it spoken out loud was like a punch to the gut. Demons weren't just ghosts. They were something far more malevolent, something designed to harm and destroy. The Smurls weren't just dealing with a few bumps in the night. They were facing an active threat, one that had already begun to tear at the fabric of their family. The Warrens explained that such entities often latched onto people, not just places. Demons could be drawn to negativity, emotional pain, conflict, or unresolved trauma. Jack and Janet couldn't help but think back to the struggles they had faced in recent years. Jack's difficult job, Janet's bouts of anxiety, the stress of raising young children. Had the house sensed their vulnerabilities and taken advantage? Ed suggested performing a spiritual cleansing of the home. It wouldn't be easy, he warned, and there was no guarantee that it would work right away. Sometimes, these entities fought back when threatened, lashing out even more violently. But the Smurls were willing to try anything. The first cleansing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, the Warrens advised the family to stay strong and not to give in to fear. "That's what it wants," Ed explained. "The more you give into it, the more power it gains. Stand together as a family and don't let it divide you." But standing strong was easier said than done. That very night, after the Warrens had left, the activity in the house reached a new level of terror. Jack and Janet were jolted awake in the middle of the night by a loud crash downstairs. It sounded like furniture had been overturned. Jack rushed to investigate, his heart pounding in his chest. The dining room table had been flipped on its side, chairs strewn across the floor. Yet there was no sign of anyone, no intruder, no open windows, nothing that could explain the mess. As Jack stood there in disbelief, a deep guttural growl echoed through the room. It was low and menacing, vibrating through the walls like an animal stalking its prey. Jack felt a surge of panic, his breath catching in his throat. He had never heard anything like it. He backed away, feeling an icy presence behind him, though when he turned, there was nothing there. Upstairs, Janet was trying to comfort the girls, who had been awakened by the noise. Dawn was sobbing, her voice shaking as she told her mother about the dark figure she had seen standing at the foot of her bed again. Heather was too scared to speak, clutching her blanket as though it were her only protection from the malevolent force lurking in the house. The following day, Ed and Lorraine returned to conduct the cleansing. Armed with holy water, crucifixes, and prayers, they walked through the house, blessing each room, calling on the entity to leave. Lorraine led the spiritual rites, her voice steady but tense. Janet and Jack followed closely, praying silently, hoping against hope that this would be enough to rid their home of the evil presence. At first, the house seemed to resist. The air grew cold, and the smell of sulfur filled the air, an unmistakable sign of something unholy. The lights flickered violently, and a mirror in the hallway shattered as if struck by an invisible force. The house groaned, as though it was alive and angry, but Lorraine pressed on, her prayers louder, more forceful. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the house seemed to settle. The oppressive feeling lifted, if only slightly. For the first time in months, Janet felt like she could breathe again. It wasn't over, she knew that much, but the tension that had been suffocating them had eased, if only for the moment. Ed warned the family that they might not be rid of the entity entirely. Sometimes, these things took time. Demonic forces in particular were known for their persistence. They would retreat, only to return stronger if given the chance. Stay vigilant, Ed told them. This could be just the beginning. For a few days, the house was quiet. Jack and Janet allowed themselves to feel a small flicker of hope. Maybe the worst was behind them. Maybe the blessing had worked. But just as they began to relax, the activity returned this time with a vengeance. It started with the shadows. Janet noticed them first dark, shifting forms that moved just out of the corner of her eye. No matter where she was in the house, she felt like something was watching her, lurking just beyond her vision. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like a distant conversation, but soon they grew louder, more distinct, until they sounded like voices speaking right next to her. But no matter where she looked, there was no one there. The final straw came one night when Jack was lying in bed, trying to sleep. He felt a pressure on his chest, as though something heavy was sitting on top of him, pinning him down. He tried to move, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by an unseen force. A cold, suffocating presence filled the room, and Jack's heart raced as he struggled to breathe. He tried to call out for Janet, but no sound escaped his lips. Suddenly, the pressure lifted, and Jack gasped for air, sitting up in bed. His body trembled, slick with sweat, and the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Janet had seen enough. Whatever they were facing was beyond anything they could handle on their own. They needed more help, and they needed it fast. The Warrens, though willing to help, knew that they would need to call in reinforcements. This wasn't just a haunting. It was an all-out battle between good and evil, and the Smurls were caught in the crossfire. The question that loomed over them all was simple, yet terrifying. How much more could they endure before the house and whatever was inside it claimed them for good? The Smurl family was trapped in an unrelenting nightmare. The spiritual cleansing performed by Ed and Lorraine Warren had offered only a brief respite. Now, the dark presence in their home was more aggressive than ever. Each night brought new terror, and even the daylight hours offered no true peace. Jack and Janet were no longer just afraid. They were exhausted, physically and emotionally worn down by the relentless assault on their family. As the days passed, they found themselves locked in a fight for their survival, both against the entity and against the growing strain on their own relationship. After Jack's terrifying encounter with the unseen force in their bedroom, the family knew they could no longer remain passive. They couldn't wait and hope that the activity would subside on its own. It was clear that the entity had no intention of leaving them in peace. Jack, who had once been the skeptic, was now the most determined to take action. He could no longer stand to see his wife and children suffer. He was determined to protect them, no matter the cost. The first step was reaching out to the church again. The priest who had blessed the house previously had been reluctant to acknowledge the possibility of something demonic, but after hearing about the escalation of the events, he agreed to return. This time, he brought with him another priest who specialized in exorcisms. The word alone sent a chill through Janet. The idea that their situation had grown dire enough to require such measures was horrifying. The two priests arrived one afternoon, armed with holy water, crucifixes, and Bibles. They walked through the house with solemn expressions, reciting prayers and sprinkling holy water in every room. Jack and Janet followed behind them, clutching their children close. Lorraine Warren had warned them that an exorcism was not a simple fix. It wasn't like in the movies. There were no dramatic confrontations with the demon where everything would be resolved in a single moment. It was a long, grueling process, and sometimes it didn't work the way people hoped. As the priests moved from room to room, the atmosphere in the house seemed to grow heavier. The temperature dropped, and a sense of unease settled over everyone. The entity was not pleased by their efforts. It was resisting. Janet could feel its presence more acutely than ever. It was as though the very walls were watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the middle of the blessing, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Everyone froze. It sounded as though something heavy had fallen, yet there had been no one upstairs. Jack and one of the priests rushed to investigate, only to find that the bedroom mirror had shattered, glass scattered across the floor. The air in the room was thick with the unmistakable stench of sulfur, a sign that the entity was growing more malevolent. Jack felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he stared at the broken glass. It was a reminder that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple haunting. The priests finished the blessing, but their faces betrayed the doubt they felt. The entity had not been driven out, and had only been angered. Janet's hope, which had already been dwindling, now felt crushed beneath the weight of despair. She could see the exhaustion in Jack's eyes. The toll this battle was taking on him. He was doing everything he could to protect their family, but the strain was becoming too much for him to bear. As the days passed, the entity's attacks became more personal. It wasn't just about fear anymore, it was about control. Jack, in particular, seemed to be targeted. He would hear voices whispering in his ear when no one else was around, telling him that he was powerless, that he couldn't protect his family. Objects would move in his presence, as if taunting him, reminding him that he was up against something far beyond his understanding. He began to lose sleep, plagued by nightmares and a constant sense of dread. Janet watched helplessly as the man she loved slowly unraveled under the pressure. The children were not spared either. Dawn, who had always been the most vocal about seeing shadowy figures in her room, now refused to sleep alone. She was terrified that the entity would come for her, and nothing Jack or Janet said could ease her fear. Heather, who had once been a carefree toddler, was now withdrawn, clinging to her mother's side at all times. The once happy family dynamic had been shattered, replaced by a constant undercurrent of tension and anxiety. One evening, as they sat in the living room trying to distract themselves with a movie, the lights suddenly flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the air grew icy cold. Jack jumped up, grabbing a flashlight, but before he could turn it on, a low growling sound filled the room. It was the same sound they had heard before, deep, guttural, and undeniably evil. Janet's heart raced as she clutched Heather to her chest. She could feel the presence in the room, circling them as if toying with them. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the room was silent once more. But the sense of dread remained, hanging over them like a dark cloud. Jack was at his breaking point. He had always been the rational one, the man who could fix things with his hands or his mind. But this was something he couldn't control. It was eating away at him, and he knew that if they didn't find a solution soon, it would destroy them. He had to do something, anything, to regain control of his life and his home. That night, as Jack lay awake in bed, unable to sleep, he made a decision. He would fight back. He wouldn't let this entity take everything from him. He began researching ways to defend against demonic forces, reading everything he could find about spiritual protection, exorcisms, and prayer. He reached out to anyone who might be able to help, from religious figures to paranormal experts. He refused to give up, even as the entity continued to wear him down. One of the experts Jack contacted suggested the entity might be using the negative energy in the house to grow stronger. The family's fear, anger, and despair were fueling it, giving it more power. If they wanted to weaken it, they would need to change their approach. Instead of focusing on the fear, they needed to focus on positivity, on love, faith, and unity. It sounded almost impossible, given the circumstances. But Jack and Janet were willing to try anything. They began to make small changes in their daily lives, trying to reclaim their home in any way they could. They prayed together as a family, ate meals together, and spent time doing activities that brought them joy. It wasn't easy. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of their eyes, reminded them of the darkness that still lurked in their home. But they were determined not to let it win. Slowly, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. The oppressive feeling of dread that had hung over them for so long began to lift, if only slightly. The entity was still there, still watching, but its power seemed to be weakening. The growling stopped, the violent outbursts became less frequent, and the shadows that had once plagued Dawn's room seemed to retreat. But the fight wasn't over. Jack and Janet knew that they were still vulnerable, and that the entity could strike again at any moment. They had to stay vigilant, to remain strong in the face of the unknown. Their love for each other, their faith, and their determination to protect their children would be their greatest weapons in the battle ahead. By the end of the chapter, the Smurls had begun to reclaim their lives, but the threat of the entity still loomed large. They had learned that the key to survival wasn't just in fighting the darkness. It was in refusing to let it consume them. The Smurl family's ordeal had stretched far beyond what they could have imagined. What began as strange noises and unsettling encounters had spiraled into a nightmare that dominated every part of their lives. They had survived for months, enduring the torment of the dark entity that inhabited their home. Through the help of experts like Ed and Lorraine Warren, priests, and their own resilience, they had managed to hold on. But they knew that the haunting had not ended. The entity, while seemingly weakened, still lingered in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. And it was during one of the darkest nights that the final confrontation unfolded. It had been a few weeks since the last major incident, and the family had started to feel a cautious sense of relief. Jack had continued his efforts to keep the negative energy at bay, focusing on family unity and positive reinforcement. Janet, too, had thrown herself into taking care of the girls, finding comfort in the small moments of normalcy they could still cling to. But the entity had merely been lying in wait, its attacks growing less frequent but more intense. That night, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost tangible, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Janet was upstairs, tucking the girls into bed, while Jack sat downstairs in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, but not really watching. He was exhausted, physically and mentally, but his mind refused to shut down. There was always that lingering anxiety, that feeling that something could go wrong at any moment. As Janet kissed Dawn and Heather goodnight, she felt a chill sweep through the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, a familiar coldness that sent a wave of dread through her body. She pulled the blankets tighter around the girls, whispering reassurances that she didn't quite believe herself. She told them to sleep tight, that everything would be okay, even though the pit in her stomach told her otherwise. Downstairs, Jack felt it too. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. His heart rate quickened as he set the remote down, his eyes scanning the room. He couldn't see anything unusual, but he didn't need to. He knew it was back. Before he could call out to Janet, the lights began to flicker. It started softly at first, a faint buzz as the bulbs dimmed, but within seconds, the flickering became violent, the entire room throbbing in harsh, rapid flashes of light and dark. Jack stood up, his instincts kicking in as he moved toward the stairs to get his family. But as soon as he reached the bottom step, a deafening crash echoed through the house. The sound was so loud it felt like the walls were shaking, and it was followed by a deep, guttural growl. The same growl that had haunted them before. "Janet!" Jack shouted, his voice cracking with fear as he bolted up the stairs 2 at a time. Janet had already heard the crash, and she was racing down the hallway toward him, her face pale. "The girls!" she gasped, but Jack grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the bedroom. They had to get the children and leave the house now. But the entity had other plans. Just as Jack reached for the bedroom door, it slammed shut with a force that knocked him back. He stumbled, pulling Janet with him as they both struggled to regain their footing. The door remained closed, though neither of them had touched it. Behind the door, they could hear Dawn and Heather screaming high-pitched, terrified shrieks that made Janet's blood run cold. "Let us in," Janet cried, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard Jack threw his weight against it, it remained locked, held by some invisible force. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway went out, plunging them into darkness. Only the faint glow of the moon through the window illuminated their surroundings, casting long shadows across the floor. The growling returned, louder this time, and it was followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if something was moving toward them from the other end of the hall. Jack's pulse raced. He had never been so scared in his life, but he knew he couldn't give in to fear. The entity thrived on it. He had to stay calm, for Janet, for the girls. Grabbing her hand, he pulled her close, whispering words of reassurance, even though every fiber of his being screamed to run. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a deep, raspy voice, one that sounded neither human nor animal, echoed through the hallway. It was speaking in a language Jack didn't understand, guttural and harsh, but the intent was clear. The entity was taunting them, asserting its control over the house, over their lives. But Jack wasn't about to let it win. "Get out of our house!" Jack yelled, his voice hoarse with desperation. He grabbed the crucifix from his pocket, the one he had been carrying ever since the Warrens had warned him to keep it close. Holding it high, he began reciting the Lord's Prayer, his voice shaky but determined. Janet, her heart pounding, joined him. She didn't know if it would work, but it was all they had. Together, they stood side by side, their voices rising above the growling, the footsteps, the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. At first, nothing happened. The entity seemed to grow stronger, the air around them growing thicker, suffocating. But Jack refused to stop. He continued to pray, louder now, as if willing the words to push the darkness back. And then, slowly, the growling began to fade. The footsteps ceased, and the air grew lighter. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on them lifted, if only slightly. The door to the girls' room suddenly flew open, and Jack and Janet rushed inside, finding Dawn and Heather huddled together on the bed, shaking and crying but unharmed. Janet scooped them up, holding them tightly, whispering over and over that everything would be okay, even though she wasn't sure it was. The entity wasn't gone. They could still feel it, lurking in the shadows, watching them. But for the first time in months, it had backed down. They had stood their ground, and it had retreated. For the next few weeks, the house remained quiet. The oppressive atmosphere that had once filled every room was lighter, and the family began to breathe a little easier. But they knew they weren't safe, not completely. The entity was still there, waiting for its chance to strike again. Jack and Janet took the girls to stay with relatives while they continued to work with the Warrens and the church to find a permanent solution. They couldn't live in fear forever, and they couldn't allow the entity to destroy their family. They had survived the worst of it, but the fight wasn't over. It never truly would be. For families like the Smurls, haunted by forces beyond human understanding, the battle between light and dark was a constant one. But they had learned something important. No matter how strong the darkness seemed, as long as they stood together, it could never fully win. In the end, the Small family had endured what many would consider unimaginable. They had faced an evil that most people never encounter, and they had survived. Their story was one of resilience, of love, and of the unbreakable bond that held them together through even the darkest of times.